We wish Emma was our only child. My mother said those words to me right in front of 30 guests at her 40th wedding anniversary party. My sister just smirked. I did not cry. I did not scream. I just turned around, walked out to my car, and took action. 1 week later, their wish came true, and their entire lives started to fall apart. But when my lawyer finally opened the envelope, my sister had laughed at my mother finally understood why I had stayed so perfectly silent. My name is Clara. I'm 32 years old, and I work as a senior corporate auditor in Chicago. Please take a moment to like and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy this story. Drop a comment and let me know where you are watching from and what time it is there. I love connecting with you all. Now let me take you to the night everything shattered. The clinking of crystal champagne flutes echoed across the grand ballroom of the Pinecrest Country Club. It was a crisp autumn evening, and the room was draped in white silk and overflowing with imported white roses. Everyone who was anyone in our suburban community was there. Local politicians, wealthy neighbors, and high-profile business partners mingled under the massive glass chandeliers. I stood near the back of the room, my feet aching in practical black heels, trying desperately to keep my eyes open. I was absolutely bone-tired. For the past 3 weeks, I had been surviving on barely 3 hours of sleep a night. My parents owned a regional logistics business that was quietly bleeding to death. They had mismanaged funds for years, ignored their tax filings, and were weeks away from a devastating federal audit. Because I was a senior corporate auditor, the burden of saving them fell entirely on my shoulders. I had spent every single night untangling their massive financial mess, reconciling hundreds of missing invoices, and restructuring their debt just to keep them out of federal prison. I did it because I loved them. I did it because I thought that was exactly what a good daughter was supposed to do. For 8 long years, I had been their invisible safety net. When their business first hit a rough patch shortly after I passed my CPA exams, my father Robert asked me for a small temporary loan. I gave it to him without hesitation, but that small loan turned into a permanent financial umbilical cord. Before I knew it, I was quietly taking over the $3,500 monthly mortgage on their sprawling suburban estate. I was paying the premium leases on my mother's Mercedes and my father's BMW. I even covered the commercial liability insurance for their logistics business. Year after year, month after month, a massive river of money flowed out of my account and into theirs. I never complained. I never demanded gratitude. I thought my sacrifice proved my loyalty. I thought that eventually, if I just worked hard enough and gave enough, they would finally see my value. But looking around the glittering ballroom that night, I realized my value was entirely transactional. My mother, Susan, glided through the crowd in a custom emerald gown that I had technically paid for. She looked radiant, accepting compliments and posing for photographs with an air of practiced royalty. Beside her was my younger sister, Emma, and Emma's husband, Trent. Emma was the undisputed golden child of the family. She was 29 years old, had never held a full-time job in her life, and spent her days curating a picture-perfect lifestyle on social media. Trent was a self-proclaimed tech entrepreneur whose startup had been failing for 3 years, though my parents constantly spoke about him like he was the next billionaire. The jazz music softened and my father tapped his fork against his crystal glass. The room quieted down immediately. Robert smiled warmly, thanking everyone for coming to celebrate 4 decades of love, resilience, and family unity. Then he handed the microphone to my mother. Susan beamed as she looked out over the crowd. She spoke eloquently about the trials and triumphs of marriage, the critical importance of a strong legacy, and the unparalleled joy of family. Then she turned her gaze directly to Emma and Trent. Her voice filled with a profound theatrical emotion. She told the crowd that looking at Emma filled her with so much pride, her heart could barely contain it. She called Emma the absolute light of the family, a true visionary, and a wonderful, devoted wife. She praised Trent for being such a strong, brilliant provider, completely ignoring the blatant fact that I was the one who had recently bailed his struggling startup out of a major vendor lawsuit. My mother raised her glass high to them, proclaiming to the entire room that Emma and Trent represented the very best of our family name. I stood in the shadows waiting for just a single mention. A small nod to my hard work. A quick thank you for saving their business this very week. Just a crumb of acknowledgement to validate the hundreds of thousands of dollars I had poured into their survival. But nothing came. Susan finished her beautiful toast. The guests applauded enthusiastically, and the string quartet resumed playing. I swallowed the heavy lump in my throat and walked toward the dining area to find my seat. The tables were elegantly arranged with silver name cards and towering floral centerpieces. I checked the main family table at the very front of the room. Robert, Susan, Emma, Trent, and Trent's parents. There were only 6 chairs. I scanned the adjacent tables, assuming I had been placed with the extended family. My name was not there either. Finally, I found my silver place card. It was at a tiny, cramped table near the swinging kitchen doors, squeezed awkwardly between a drafty service exit and the busy waitstaff clearing station. I was seated with distant cousins I had not seen in a decade, and a random +1 who did not even know our family. I felt a cold, sharp flush of humiliation creep up the back of my neck. I was the one keeping a roof over their heads. I was the one keeping them out of bankruptcy. Yet I was seated like an unwanted, embarrassing guest. I walked over to the main table, where my mother was sipping her champagne and laughing at something Trent had said. I kept my voice low and polite, absolutely determined not to cause a scene on her special night. I gently asked her why I was seated back by the kitchen doors instead of with my own family. Susan sighed. It was an exaggerated, theatrical sound of profound annoyance. She looked at me, slowly taking in my plain navy suit, my tired, bloodshot eyes, and my lack of glamorous jewelry. She leaned in close, her voice dropping to a harsh, venomous whisper that carried just enough for Emma and Trent to hear. She said I was ruining the aesthetic of the family table. She told me I looked exhausted, drab, and miserable, and she absolutely did not want my negative energy dragging down the celebratory mood in front of Trent's wealthy parents. I stared at her, completely stunned. I reminded her, my voice trembling slightly, that I was exhausted because I had been awake until 4 a.m, fixing their fraudulent IRS filings so they would not lose everything they owned. That was when my mother snapped. She did not lower her voice this time. She spoke loudly, clearly, her words slicing through the ambient noise of the luxurious room. "We wish Emma was our only child." The words struck me with the force of a physical blow. The polite conversations at the surrounding tables abruptly stopped. Several wealthy guests turned to look at us, their eyes wide with shock. My mother did not flinch. She did not look embarrassed. She stared right at me, with eyes completely devoid of warmth or maternal affection. She told me I was always making things difficult, always demanding unnecessary attention, and always acting like a pathetic burden. She said Emma brought them pure joy and elevated their social standing, while I only brought them stress and misery. I looked at my father, desperate for him to intervene. Robert simply looked away, taking a sudden, intense interest in folding his linen napkin. I looked at Trent. He was aggressively pretending to scroll through his phone, avoiding my gaze entirely. And then I looked at my sister. Emma was looking right at me, and she smirked. It was a slow, cruel, incredibly victorious smirk. She was thoroughly enjoying my public execution. In that fraction of a second, 28 years of desperately seeking their love and approval simply evaporated into thin air. The heavy, crushing weight of financial and emotional obligation I had carried for nearly a decade vanished, replaced by a crystalline, absolute clarity. I did not argue with my mother. I did not defend my actions or list my sacrifices. I did not shed a single tear. I just looked at the woman who gave birth to me, nodded once, and told her I completely understood. I turned my back on my family and walked out of the ballroom. I did not rush. I kept my head high, my shoulders pulled back, my steps measured, deliberate and calm. I felt the shocked eyes of 30 guests burning into my back, but I truly did not care anymore. I pushed through the heavy glass doors of the country club and stepped out into the cool, damp night air. The parking lot was quiet, illuminated only by the soft yellow glow of the street lamps. I walked to my sensible, reliable sedan, unlocked the door, and slid into the driver's seat. The silence inside the car was deafening, but it was peaceful. My hands were not shaking. I was not crying. The overwhelming, bone-deep exhaustion that had plagued me for weeks was suddenly completely gone, entirely replaced by a sharp, focused, electric energy. I reached into my purse and pulled out my phone. The screen cast a pale blue glow in the dark interior of the car. I opened my banking application. The secure interface loaded, displaying the healthy, robust balance I had built through years of relentless corporate auditing and smart investing. I navigated straight to the automatic payments dashboard. There it was, a pristine, highly organized list of my financial servitude. First on the list was the mortgage, $3,500 scheduled to be withdrawn directly from my account on the first of every single month. The massive house they lived in, the house they hosted, their extravagant parties, in the house they proudly claimed as their own, to all their country club friends. I tapped the screen. A warning prompt appeared asking if I was absolutely sure I wanted to permanently delete this recurring transfer. I clicked yes. Gone. Next were the luxury car leases, $900 for Susan's Mercedes, $800 for Robert's BMW, the gleaming vehicles they had parked so proudly at the country club VIP entrance tonight. I tapped the screen twice. Deleted. Gone. Then came the business insurance. $1,200 a month to keep their failing logistics company legally compliant and operational. Without that active policy, their commercial contracts would be automatically voided within a matter of days. I pressed delete. Gone. Finally, I opened my email client. I found the heavily drafted tax reconciliation documents I had meticulously prepared to send to the IRS on their behalf on Monday morning. The vital documents that would save them from massive federal penalties and potential criminal charges for tax evasion. I selected the entire folder. I moved it to the trash. I emptied the trash. In less than 5 minutes, sitting completely alone in a dimly lit parking lot, I completely dismantled the artificial foundation of my parents' wealthy, arrogant lifestyle. I systematically severed the arteries of cash that had kept their entire world afloat for 8 long years. My mother had looked me in the eye and told me they wished I did not exist. I simply granted her wish. As far as their finances, their home, and their business were concerned, I was now officially a ghost. I put my phone down in the passenger seat and started the engine. The radio clicked on, playing a soft, steady jazz melody. I pulled out of the country club parking lot, leaving my entire toxic family behind to enjoy their expensive champagne, their cruel jokes, and their precious golden child. I drove toward the city, toward my own apartment, toward a future that belonged only to me. I knew the fallout would be catastrophic. I knew that within a matter of days, their accounts would overdraw, their checks would aggressively bounce, and their pristine fake image would shatter into a million pieces. But sitting in that car, watching the streetlights blur past my window, I felt a profound, untouchable peace. The storm was coming for them, but for the very first time in my life, I was no longer standing in the rain. The cool leather of the steering wheel grounded me as I navigated the winding roads away from the Pinecrest Country Club. For the first few miles, the only sound was the rhythmic hum of my tires against the damp pavement and the steady beating of my own heart. I kept my eyes fixed on the yellow lines of the road, half expecting a wave of suffocating guilt to wash over me. That was the pattern I had lived with for my entire adult life. Defy my mother, feel guilty. Question my father, feel guilty. Refuse to fund my sisters. Lavish lifestyle, feel overwhelming. Paralyzing guilt. But as the distance between me and that glittering ballroom grew, the guilt never came. Instead, my chest felt incredibly light. I had just severed the financial arteries that kept my family's illusion alive, and I was still breathing. I thought about the banking application on my phone, resting innocently in the passenger seat. With a few taps, I had stopped the $3,500 monthly mortgage payments. I had canceled the premium auto leases. I had voided the commercial liability insurance for their logistics business. I had done it all in less than 5 minutes. It was almost frightening how simple it was to dismantle a prison you had built with your own hands. But the architecture of that prison had taken nearly a decade to construct. It started so quietly that I never even realized I was being caged. It began right after I secured my position as a corporate auditor. I was 24 years old, making a respectable salary, and desperate to prove my worth to parents who had spent my entire childhood praising my sister Emma. My father had come to me one evening looking defeated. He said the logistics business had hit a temporary cash flow problem. He needed $5,000 to cover payroll, just a bridge loan he promised. He looked me in the eyes and told me how proud he was of my financial stability. It was the first time I could remember him expressing genuine pride in me. I transferred the money that very night. He never paid it back. I never asked him to. I thought I was being a good daughter, but that $5,000 was merely the down payment on a lifetime of financial servitude. The requests became a steady, undeniable current. When my mother's car broke down, she told me that successful families support each other, and surely a senior auditor could help her mother secure a reliable vehicle. That turned into a $900 monthly lease for a luxury sedan. When Emma met Trent, my parents insisted that we had to project wealth to ensure she married into his affluent circle. Trent was a self-proclaimed entrepreneur with grand ideas and absolutely zero revenue. But my mother was mesmerized by him. She told me it was my duty as the successful practical sister to help Trent launch his vision. That was how Trent ended up with a credit card linked directly to my primary checking account. My father had convinced me it was strictly for emergency vendor payments for the family business, but Trent quickly gained access to it. Whenever I questioned the charges, expensive dinners, flights to technology conferences that looked suspiciously like vacations, premium golf club fees, my mother would unleash her weaponized disappointment. She would tell me I was being terribly stingy. She would say I lacked vision and that I was trying to sabotage my sister's happiness out of pure jealousy. I endured it because I believed that if I fixed enough of their problems, they would eventually love me the way they loved Emma. I became their personal crisis manager. I negotiated with their angry vendors. I balanced their chaotic ledgers. I poured hundreds of thousands of dollars into their bottomless pit of manufactured emergencies. I bought their love on an agonizing installment plan, only to find out tonight that the product had never actually been in stock. We wish Emma was our only child. Those words echoed in the quiet cabin of my car, absolute and final. Suddenly, the sharp, jarring ringtone of my phone shattered the silence. The screen illuminated the dark interior of the car. It was a text message from Trent. I kept my eyes on the road, letting the phone go dark. 10 seconds later, it buzzed again. Then again. 3 rapid, frantic vibrations. I pulled over into the parking lot of a closed grocery store, put the car in park, and picked up the phone. Trent had sent 3 messages in rapid succession. The first one read, "Clara, my card just got declined at the country club bar. Try to fix the bank glitch right now. I have a massive tab open with my parents and your dad." The second message arrived a minute later. "Clara, are you ignoring me? The bartender is holding my card. This is incredibly embarrassing. Transfer funds into the account immediately." The third message was just a string of angry question marks. I stared at the screen, a slow, deep realization settling into my bones. Trent was not checking to see if I was okay after my mother had just publicly humiliated me. He did not care that I had walked out of the venue looking completely broken. He only cared that the plastic rectangle in his wallet had stopped dispensing my hard-earned money. He was standing at a premium mahogany bar surrounded by his wealthy parents and my arrogant father trying to purchase top-shelf liquor using the salary of the woman they had all just discarded. Before I could even process the absolute audacity of his messages, my phone began to ring. It was my mother, Susan. I watched her name flash across the screen. For 28 years, that specific ringtone had commanded my immediate obedience. Whenever Susan called, I answered. I dropped my spreadsheets. I canceled my weekend plans. I rearranged my entire life to cater to her latest manufactured crisis. I let it ring. The sound echoed in the small car, loud and demanding. It stopped and then immediately started again. She was double-calling a tactic she used when she wanted to ensure I knew she was furious. I watched the screen silently until it went to voicemail. A moment later, a text message from her appeared. "Clara, pick up your phone this instant. Trent is standing at the bar looking like a complete fool because your credit card is frozen. You are ruining the most important night of our lives over a petty temper tantrum. Fix your bank account right now and apologize to Trent." I read the words carefully. There was no apology for her cruel toast. There was no remorse for wishing I did not exist. There was only pure, unadulterated outrage that the financial utility I provided had been abruptly suspended. She did not miss her daughter. She missed her bank. I sat in the glow of the streetlights, feeling the last remaining threads of my familial loyalty completely dissolve. I typed out a reply, my fingers moving steadily across the glass screen. "I am not fixing anything I wrote. You told 30 people you wished Emma was your only child. I am simply granting your wish. Do not contact me again." I pressed send. The satisfaction was immediate, a warm, solid feeling in the center of my chest. The reaction was instantaneous. My phone screen lit up like a fireworks display. Susan began calling again, back to back, relentlessly. Then my father started calling. Robert, the man who had stared blankly at his linen napkin while my mother publicly executed my character, was suddenly highly motivated to speak with me now that his business credit card was declining. I watched his name flash on the screen. I remembered all the nights I had stayed awake until dawn, drinking stale coffee, trying to balance his fraudulent ledgers. I remembered the sheer terror I felt when I realized he was hiding massive debts from the Internal Revenue Service. I had risked my own professional reputation as a corporate auditor to restructure his mess, all while he treated me like a glorified secretary. Now he was calling because the free ride was over. I silenced the phone. I did not block them yet because the auditor in me knew that preserving a digital paper trail of their frantic aggression might be necessary later. I simply turned off the volume, disabled the vibration, and tossed the device onto the passenger seat. It continued to light up a silent, desperate beacon in the dark car. I put the car back into drive and pulled out of the parking lot. The rain had started to fall, gentle drops hitting the windshield, washing away the dust of the city. I drove toward my apartment, my sanctuary. As I navigated the familiar streets, my mind began to automatically calculate the exact timeline of their impending financial collapse. Without my $3,500 mortgage payment on the first of the month, their bank would issue a late notice within 15 days. Without the commercial liability insurance payment, their logistics company would receive a suspension warning by the end of the week. Their major clients required active liability coverage to maintain their shipping contracts. Once those contracts were suspended, the business would effectively cease to operate. And then there were the cars, the luxury vehicles they drove to project an image of unearned wealth. The leasing company would not care about Susan's country club status. They would only care that the automatic draft had failed. I had spent years terrified of this exact scenario. I had sacrificed my own savings, my own peace of mind, just to prevent them from facing the consequences of their reckless vanity. I'd convinced myself that keeping them afloat was the only way to keep our family together. But tonight had revealed the ultimate truth. There was no family to keep together. There was only a host and a group of very comfortable parasites. My phone continued to flash silently on the passenger seat. I glanced at it at a red light. The notifications were piling up. Texts from Trent, texts from Emma. Emma, who had smirked while my mother verbally destroyed me, was now texting me. I could see the preview of her message on the lock screen. "Clara, you are being completely unreasonable. Trent's parents are asking questions. Turn the card back on right now." I actually let out a small, genuine laugh. It was a sound I had not heard from myself in months. They honestly believed this was just a temporary rebellion. They thought I was simply throwing a tantrum, and that if they commanded me aggressively enough, I would eventually fall back into line, apologize for the inconvenience, and resume my post as their silent benefactor. They fundamentally underestimated exactly who they were dealing with. I was an auditor. My entire profession was built on identifying discrepancies, locating missing assets, and executing structural corrections without emotion. For years, I had applied that skill set to saving their lives. Now I was applying it to saving my own. I turned down the familiar tree-lined street of my neighborhood. My apartment building came into view, a modest, well-maintained brick complex that my mother had always criticized for being too ordinary. She preferred sweeping driveways and grand foyers, the kind of things I had been paying for while living in this ordinary building. I parked in my assigned spot, turned off the engine, and picked up my phone. There were 42 unread messages and 17 missed calls. The digital fallout was spectacular. The sheer volume of their panic was a testament to exactly how heavily they had relied on my unseen labor. They were drowning, and for the very first time, I was refusing to throw them a lifeline. I gathered my purse, stepped out of the car, and locked the doors. The cool rain felt refreshing against my face. I walked up the stairs to my apartment, unlocked the door, and stepped inside. The space was quiet, warm, and entirely mine. There were no financial fires to put out. There were no ledgers to desperately balance before morning. There were no cruel comparisons or subtle insults waiting for me in the living room. I placed my phone on the kitchen counter. It lit up one more time. A final text from my father. "Clara, we need to talk about the mortgage. Do not do something you will regret." I looked at the message, feeling absolutely nothing but a profound, unshakable resolve. I had already done the thing I regretted. I had spent 8 years trying to buy love from a family that only valued my bank account. The only thing I would do differently from this moment forward was protect myself. I turned my back on the flashing screen, walked into my bedroom, and prepared to sleep. The financial umbilical cord was officially cut. The panic at the country club was just the beginning. I knew that tomorrow, the reality of their situation would hit them with the force of a freight train. But tonight, I was going to rest. For the first time in nearly a decade, I was entirely wonderfully free. I closed my eyes, the silent flashing of the phone in the other room entirely forgotten. The storm was raging for them, but inside my walls there was nothing but absolute peace. I woke up the morning after the country club disaster before the sun even fully crested the horizon. My apartment was quiet, a stark contrast to the digital war zone that was happening on my silenced phone. I knew Susan and Robert's Sunday routine like clockwork. They never missed their prestigious brunch at the club, a weekly ritual to project status and wealth to their affluent neighbors. Even with their credit cards declining the night before, Susan would rather walk over hot coals than miss an opportunity to show her face and pretend everything was absolutely perfect. I knew the house would be empty for exactly 3 hours. There was only one reason I needed to go back to that sprawling, toxic estate. My late grandfather's antique gold pocket watch. It was the only item of true value in my life, not because of the gold, but because of the man who owned it. Grandpa Thomas was the only person in my family who ever saw me as a real person, not just a utility or a background character. When he passed away, he told me to keep the watch safe. I had left it hidden in a vintage lockbox in my old childhood bedroom, unwilling to bring it to my first cramped apartments because I was terrified of losing it. Now that the financial cord between me and my parents was permanently cut, I knew my mother would eventually scour my old room. She would hold the watch hostage to force my compliance, or worse, she would pawn it to cover the lease on her Mercedes. I needed to retrieve it before they fully realized the devastating extent of my severance. The drive to the suburbs felt entirely different today. The tree-lined streets and manicured lawns of their affluent neighborhood no longer intimidated me. They just looked like a Hollywood set, made of cheap plywood and false promises. I parked 2 blocks away out of an abundance of caution and walked the rest of the distance. The crisp morning air stung my cheeks, keeping me alert. I used my original brass key to unlock the heavy oak front door. The house was completely silent, smelling of Susan's expensive floral perfumes and the lingering scent of stale wine from the night before. I walked past the grand dining room where the crystal glasses and silver platters were perfectly arranged on the mahogany table. Everything in the public areas was designed purely for show. But as I moved down the hallway toward the back of the house, the illusion quickly faded. I went straight upstairs to my old room. It had long been converted into Emma's overflow closet, filled with designer dresses, expensive shoes, and luxury handbags I had likely paid for. I pushed past the racks of silk and velvet, reached into the dark corner of the top shelf, and felt the cool metal of the vintage lockbox. I punched in the combination. The watch was still there. I slipped the heavy gold timepiece into my jacket pocket, feeling a profound sense of relief wash over me. My final emotional tie to this house was secured. I was ready to walk out the front door and never look back. But as I descended the curved staircase, I noticed the door to my father's private study was wide open. Robert always kept that door locked. Always. The fact that it was open meant he had left in a severe, blinding rush. Given the financial panic I had initiated the night before by canceling all their auto payments, I knew exactly why he was careless. I stopped at the threshold. As a senior corporate auditor, my brain is hardwired to notice anomalies and irregularities. The massive mahogany desk in the center of the room was completely covered in thick stacks of paper-red, urgent tabs and highlighted sticky notes. I told myself to leave. I had already deleted the payments. I was done with them. But the sheer volume of financial documents scattered across the desk pulled me into the room like a magnet. I walked over my practical black heels, making absolutely no sound on the thick Persian rug. I looked down at the center pile. The logo at the top of the foremost document belonged to a major national commercial bank, one I knew my parents did not currently do business with. The header read, Commercial Real Estate Collateralized Loan Agreement. I picked up the first page. The numbers printed in bold black ink made the breath catch in my throat. $850,000. My parents were applying for a massive second mortgage against the estate, but they were already drowning in severe debt. Their logistics company was weeks away from total insolvency. No legitimate bank would ever approve a loan of that staggering size based on their actual dismal tax returns. I began to flip through the pages, my eyes scanning the dense legal jargon and financial disclosures with practiced rapid speed. The stated purpose of the loan was listed as a corporate expansion for the logistics business. But right beneath that, I saw the designated routing numbers for the initial cash disbursement. The routing information did not match my parents' business accounts. I knew their logistics routing numbers by heart. The requested disbursement account belonged to a limited liability company registered in the state of Delaware. It was Trent's company, his failing technology startup, the startup that had zero revenue, zero viable products, and a mounting pile of aggressive vendor lawsuits. Susan and Robert were not just borrowing money to save their own skin. They were leveraging the roof over their heads to hand nearly $1 million directly to the golden child's husband. They were willing to risk absolute ruin just to maintain the illusion that Emma had married a successful entrepreneur. But the shock of the loan amount paled in comparison to what I saw on page 7. My hands went completely numb. The document required the signature of the primary property owner to authorize the massive lien against the estate. There on the dotted line written in blue ink was my name, Clara. I traced the curves of the letters with my eyes. It was a forgery. It was a decent attempt at mimicking the signature I used on my corporate audit reports, but I knew my own handwriting intimately. The loops were slightly too rigid. The pressure applied to the pen was far too heavy. Robert and Susan had intentionally forged my signature on a federal banking document. The pieces of a massive, terrifying puzzle snapped together in my mind with sickening clarity. For years, my parents had paraded around the country club, proudly claiming ownership of this sprawling suburban estate, but they did not own it. My grandfather Thomas, a man who saw right through his daughter's vanity and his son-in-law's incompetence, had structured his will with absolute legal precision. He left the deed to the property in a blind trust, and he named me as the sole trustee and outright owner upon my 25th birthday. My parents were legally nothing more than tenants, living in my house, rent-free, an arrangement I had permitted for years, out of a deeply misguided sense of family loyalty. They knew they did not own the house. They knew the commercial bank would require the legal owner's strict authorization to process a second mortgage. So instead of asking me, instead of admitting they were desperate and needed my help to fund Trent's sinking ship, they decided to bypass me entirely. They stole my identity. They fabricated false income statements, using my credentials as a senior auditor to bolster the fraudulent application. They were actively attempting federal wire fraud, bank fraud, and identity theft, all neatly packaged in a manila folder on my father's mahogany desk. The air in the study suddenly felt impossibly thin. I had to remind myself to breathe. This was no longer just a story of emotional neglect or financial manipulation. This was not just about Susan wishing Emma was her only child, or Robert treating me like a free accountant to balance his messy books. This was a severe, highly coordinated criminal conspiracy. If the bank processed this fraudulent loan and the funds were wired to Trent's failing startup, the massive debt would be legally tied directly to my name. When Trent inevitably defaulted on the payments, the bank would foreclose on the estate, destroying my grandfather's precious legacy and entirely ruining my pristine credit, my career, and my professional auditing licensing. They were willing to send me to federal prison just to buy Emma a few more months of pretending to be a wealthy socialite. My initial shock quickly morphed into a cold, absolute rage. The kind of rage that slows your heart rate down and sharpens your vision until everything is crystal clear. I did not freeze. I did not panic. The senior corporate auditor inside me took total, calculated control. I pulled my phone from my jacket pocket and opened the camera application. I began photographing every single page on that desk. I captured the forged signature from multiple angles. I photographed the fraudulent income statements they had mocked up using my stolen credentials. I took clear, high-resolution pictures of the wire transfer instructions directing the funds to Trent's account. I even photographed the small yellow sticky notes in Susan's distinct handwriting that explicitly detailed the timeline for the final bank submission on Monday morning. I checked my watch. I had been inside the house for exactly 25 minutes. My parents would be at the country club brunch for at least another 2 hours, aggressively complaining to the waitstaff and loudly pretending their credit cards were simply experiencing a temporary banking error. I gathered the most critical original documents, the specific pages containing the forged signatures and the direct wire instructions. I slid them carefully into the inner pocket of my jacket, right next to my grandfather's solid gold watch. They would notice the missing pages eventually, but by the time they realized what had happened, the trap would already be firmly set. I walked out of the study, leaving the heavy wooden door wide open exactly as I had found it. I moved down the hallway, my footsteps steady and completely deliberate. I looked at the framed family portraits lining the expensive wallpaper, pictures of Susan and Robert smiling brightly on vacations I had paid for. Pictures of Emma and Trent looking like a glossy magazine advertisement. There were absolutely no pictures of me. I'd always believed my absence from those walls was a cruel punishment. Now, looking at the evidence of their felony crimes sitting heavy against my chest, I realized my absence was a profound blessing. I was not part of their corrupt, fake reality. I stepped out the front door, locked it securely behind me, and walked briskly down the quiet, tree-lined street back to my car. As I sat in the driver's seat and started the engine, the sheer magnitude of what I had just uncovered completely settled over me. They had thrown me away. They had publicly humiliated me in front of 30 people. They had explicitly declared they wished I did not exist. And yet, behind closed doors, they were desperately trying to steal my name and my future, just to save themselves. I put the car in drive and pulled away from the curb. I was not going back to my apartment. I was going straight downtown. I needed to see Mr. Harrison, my grandfather's fierce veteran estate attorney. The financial umbilical cord was permanently cut, but now it was time to systematically tear down the entire fraudulent house they had built on my back. I gripped the steering wheel, a cold smile forming on my lips. Susan wanted Emma to be an only child. I was going to make sure she got exactly what she asked for. The rain had finally stopped, but the streets of the affluent suburb were slick and dark. The tires of my practical sedan hissed against the wet asphalt. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned completely white. I drove away from the sprawling multi-million-dollar estate that my parents pretended to own. In the inner pocket of my jacket, pressing safely against my chest, was my late grandfather's solid gold antique pocket watch. It was the only item in that massive house that held any genuine warmth. But right next to that watch, tucked into the same secure pocket, were the original pages of the forged commercial real estate collateralized loan agreement. Those few sheets of paper felt far heavier than the gold watch. They felt exactly like a loaded weapon. They were not just toxic parents anymore. They were active criminals. They were willfully attempting federal wire fraud, major bank fraud, and severe identity theft. They were perfectly willing to completely destroy my life, my pristine credit score, and my hard-earned professional license as a senior corporate auditor, all just to hand nearly $1 million to Trent's failing technology startup. The sheer breathtaking malice of their plan echoed in my mind. They wanted to maintain the glittering illusion of Emma's perfect marriage so badly that they would happily send me to federal prison to fund it. The sticky notes I had found on my father's desk were dated from last week. They had been practicing my forged signature while I was exhausting myself balancing their IRS ledgers. They had smiled at me at the anniversary party, knowing they were about to steal my identity. The towering steel and glass high-rise in downtown Chicago looked imposing against the gray afternoon sky. I pulled into the private underground parking garage, my mind racing through complex financial algorithms and legal liabilities. I bypassed the main lobby and took the private elevator directly to the top floor. The heavy double doors of the firm opened to a quiet, immaculate reception area. I did not have an appointment, but the moment the senior receptionist saw my face, she immediately stood up and ushered me straight back to the corner office. Mr. Harrison was a man carved from old-school integrity. He was in his late 60s, wearing a sharp charcoal suit with silver hair and piercing gray eyes that missed absolutely nothing. He had been my grandfather's closest friend and most trusted legal counsel for over 40 years. He was the man who had drafted the blind trust protecting the estate. He was the man who knew exactly what my parents were truly capable of. When I walked into his office, the heavy scent of aged leather and polished mahogany grounded me. I did not bother with pleasantries. I did not sit down. I simply reached into my jacket, pulled out the stolen original pages, and placed my phone directly on the center of his immaculate desk. I told him to look at the screen. I told him to look at the paperwork. Mr. Harrison slowly put on his reading glasses. The silence in the expansive office grew incredibly heavy. I watched his eyes scan the high-resolution photographs I had taken just an hour ago. He read the loan application. He scrutinized the forged signature at the bottom of page 7. He meticulously examined the routing numbers that pointed directly to Trent's fraudulent Delaware-based limited liability company. I watched the transformation happen in real time. The warm, grandfatherly man completely vanished. In his place sat a ruthless, highly aggressive veteran litigator. When he finally looked up, his jaw was set in a tight, furious line. He asked me with a cold, terrifying calm if I was absolutely certain my father had drafted this. I told him I was positive. I explained the exact timeline, the sticky notes written in my mother's distinct cursive handwriting, and the brazen arrogance of leaving the felony evidence sitting out in the open on the mahogany desk. Mr. Harrison leaned back in his heavy leather chair and interlaced his fingers. He explained the exact legal severity of the crimes they were attempting to commit. He told me this was not a simple family dispute over a shared bank account or a misunderstood financial boundary. This was a highly coordinated, premeditated criminal conspiracy. By forging my signature on a commercial real estate document, they were committing first-degree forgery. By planning to transmit those fraudulent documents to a federally insured financial institution, they were committing severe bank fraud. And by directing the dispersed funds to a separate corporate entity across state lines, they were initiating federal wire fraud. Mr. Harrison looked me dead in the eye and told me that if they succeeded, I would be legally responsible for $850,000 in phantom debt. When Trent inevitably bankrupted his useless company, the bank would ruthlessly seize the estate, entirely destroy my credit, and permanently end my career. They were fully prepared to sacrifice my entire existence just to keep up appearances at the country club. A fresh suffocating wave of panic hit me. I reached for my phone, my fingers trembling slightly. I told Mr. Harrison that I needed to call the bank right now. I needed to cancel the application immediately. I told him I was going to call my parents, confront them, and stop them before they could do any more damage. I wanted to scream at them. I wanted to demand to know how my mother could look me in the eye at her anniversary party and wish I did not exist, all while plotting to steal my identity behind my back. But Mr. Harrison reached across the desk and firmly placed his hand over mine, stopping me from picking up the phone. He shook his head slowly. He told me that confronting them right now was the absolute worst mistake I could possibly make. I stared at him, completely confused and desperate. I asked him why we would just sit and wait when they were planning to submit the forged documents on Monday morning. Mr. Harrison explained the brutal legal reality of our situation with cold, strategic precision. He said that if I called my parents today and confronted them, they would immediately realize I had found their hidden paperwork. They would panic. They would instantly shred the remaining documents, burn my mother's handwritten sticky notes, and completely destroy the paper trail. Then, they would spin a brand new, highly destructive narrative. They would claim I was acting hysterical. They would tell the entire extended family, their wealthy friends at the country club, and the local authorities that I had broken into their home, stolen routine business paperwork, and fabricated a crazy story out of pure jealousy because I hated my sister. Without the fully executed submission to the bank, it would just be my word against theirs. They would paint themselves as the innocent victims of an unstable, vindictive daughter who was lashing out because she was jealous of her sister's perfect marriage. Mr. Harrison told me we could absolutely not let them control the narrative. We needed undeniable, bulletproof proof of their criminal intent. We needed them to willingly walk right into a federal trap. I felt my stomach twist into knots. I asked him what exactly he wanted me to do. Mr. Harrison leaned forward, the sharp afternoon light of the city skyline reflecting in his gray eyes. He said we were going to do absolutely nothing to stop them. We were going to patiently let them submit the fraudulent loan application to the commercial bank on Monday morning. We were going to let them cross the legal point of no return. I took a deep, shaky breath, processing the sheer magnitude of what he was suggesting. It was terrifying, but the brilliant, ruthless logic of it began to settle deeply into my mind. By allowing Robert and Susan to formally submit the forged documents, we were permanently locking in their criminal liability. They would be explicitly providing fraudulent documents to a regulated financial institution. The crime would be complete documented and fully auditable by federal authorities. Mr. Harrison explained that he personally knew the senior vice president of the fraud department at that specific commercial bank. While my parents thought they were successfully securing nearly $1 million, Mr. Harrison would preemptively alert the bank's fraud division. The bank would accept the application, flag it immediately within their internal system, and secure the definitive proof of the forgery without ever releasing a single dime to Trent's failing company. The strategy was absolutely flawless, but it required me to maintain total, unbreakable silence. I had to let them believe their master plan was working perfectly. I had to completely ignore their angry text messages about the canceled auto payments and pretend I was simply sulking about the anniversary party. I asked Mr. Harrison what would happen after the bank flagged the fraud. He opened a fresh legal pad and clicked his silver pen. He said that while the bank was building the criminal fraud dossier, we would be preparing our own civil and financial execution. For the next 3 hours, we sat in that quiet corner office and meticulously drafted the absolute end of my parents' entirely fake empire. Mr. Harrison began preparing the formal eviction notices, since my parents had attempted to use the property to commit a major felony against the legal owner. Any leniency regarding their tenancy was officially and permanently void. We drafted a strict 72-hour notice to vacate the premises, explicitly detailing that any damage to the estate would be met with immediate aggressive civil litigation. But we did not stop at the eviction. Mr. Harrison pulled the historical records of their failing logistics business. Since I had been the one personally funding their commercial liability insurance, and since they were actively trying to defraud me, I had grounds to immediately secure my assets. We drafted aggressive asset seizure warnings to recoup the hundreds of thousands of dollars they had functionally stolen from me over the past 8 years under false pretenses. We built an impenetrable fortress of legal documents. Every single lie they had told, every manipulation they had pulled, every dollar they had taken was translated into cold, hard legal consequences. Mr. Harrison told me that we would not serve these notices through the mail. We would not send a process server to their door. We would deliver them in person in his office in front of the entire family. We would let them walk into the boardroom thinking they were coming to finalize their massive loan transfer. They would show up wearing their designer clothes, smiling their arrogant smiles, absolutely certain they had won the ultimate prize. And then we would drop the anvil on their heads. I sat back in the heavy leather chair. The fear that had gripped me when I first saw those forged signatures was completely gone. In its place was a profound, unshakable strength. My mother had always treated me like I was weak, practical, and useful only as a silent workhorse. She had severely miscalculated. She had trained me to be meticulous. She had forced me to understand complex financial structures to save her business. She had made me a senior corporate auditor. And now I was going to ruthlessly audit my own family. Mr. Harrison printed the first drafts of the legal notices. The thick, crisp paper felt heavy and solid in my hands. It felt exactly like justice. He looked at me across the desk and asked if I was ready to stay completely silent for the entire weekend. I looked at the man who had been a better father figure to me than my own flesh and blood. I told him I had spent 28 years practicing my silence. 3 more days would be absolutely effortless. I thanked him, gathered my coat, and walked out of the heavy glass doors of his firm. The Chicago skyline was beginning to light up against the evening sky, a sea of bright lights pushing back the dark. My phone buzzed in my pocket. It was another demanding, angry text from my sister Emma, complaining that my stubbornness was ruining her weekend plans. I looked at the message, smiled a genuine quiet smile, and turned my phone completely off. The trap was set. All I had to do now was wait for them to walk right into it. For 3 excruciating days, I maintained absolute radio silence. It is fascinating what happens to manipulative people when you simply refuse to engage. The frantic text messages eventually slowed down, replaced by a tense, waiting silence. I spent those days going to my office, auditing corporate accounts, and keeping my mind completely focused on the strategy Mr. Harrison had laid out for me. I knew they were panicking. Without my auto payments, the reality of their massive debt was closing in on them. They needed that fraudulent loan to go through, and they needed my signature to make it happen. I just had to wait for them to make their move. The move came on Tuesday afternoon, exactly as Mr. Harrison had predicted. My phone vibrated on my desk. The caller ID displayed my mother's name. I let it ring 3 times before I picked up, pressing the phone to my ear and taking a slow, measured breath. Clara Susan said. Her voice was entirely different from the venomous tone she had used at the country club. It was soft wavering, drenched in a manufactured vulnerability that I had fallen for 1,000 times before. She sounded exactly like a mother who had just realized she had made a terrible mistake. I asked her what she wanted. I kept my voice completely flat and professional. She let out a small, rehearsed sigh. "I want to apologize," she said. "Your father and I have been talking nonstop since the anniversary party. We were under so much stress with the business, and I took it out on you. What I said was unforgivable. I am so incredibly sorry, Clara. We do not want to lose our daughter over a stupid argument. Please, can you come over for dinner tonight? Just the three of us. Emma and Trent are out of town. We want to make things right." I sat in my office chair and stared out the window at the Seattle skyline. If I had not seen the forged loan documents with my own eyes, if I had not photographed the sticky notes explicitly detailing their criminal timeline, I might have actually believed her. It was a terrifyingly good performance. She played the remorseful, loving mother perfectly, but I knew the truth. This was not a reconciliation dinner. It was an ambush. They needed the final physical signature to satisfy the bank, and they needed to trick me into giving it to them. I let a few seconds of silence hang on the line, letting her sweat just a little bit. Then I softened my voice just enough to sound hesitant but hopeful. I told her I would come. I told her I wanted to make things right too. The sheer palpable relief in her voice when she thanked me was almost sickening. We agreed on 7 o'clock. I left work early that day to make a very specific stop at an office supply store downtown. I walked down the aisles until I found exactly what I was looking for, a pack of blue gel pens. But these were not ordinary pens. They were premium friction erasable pens. The ink flows smoothly and looks absolutely permanent on paper, but when exposed to heat like a lighter, a hairdryer, or even just sitting in a hot car, the ink completely vanishes without leaving a single trace. I bought the pens in blue ink, knowing that financial institutions heavily prefer blue ink for original signatures to distinguish them from photocopies. When I got back to my apartment, I tested the pen meticulously. I wrote my name on a piece of printer paper, applying the exact same pressure I normally would. The signature looked dark professional and entirely permanent. Then I plugged in my hairdryer and held it over the paper. Within 5 seconds, the blue ink completely disappeared. The page was perfectly blank again. It was exactly what I needed. I placed the pen securely in the inner pocket of my purse, right next to my phone. The drive to the suburbs felt like driving into a highly orchestrated stage play. I knew my lines. I knew their motives. I just had to hit my marks. I pulled into the sweeping driveway of the estate just before 7. The house was brightly lit, projecting the same wealthy, flawless image it always did. I parked my modest sedan, took a deep breath, and set my phone to voice memo mode. I pressed record, locked the screen, and slipped the phone into my breast pocket, where the microphone would capture every single word clearly. Susan opened the front door before I even had the chance to knock. She was wearing a soft cashmere sweater, projecting the image of a cozy, welcoming mother. She pulled me into a tight embrace. Her perfume smelled the same as it always did, but the hug felt incredibly hollow. I hugged her back, playing my part perfectly. Robert came out of the kitchen, wiping his hands on a dish towel. He smiled a wide, genial expression that completely masked the fact that he was actively trying to commit federal identity theft against the daughter currently standing in his foyer. He told me how glad he was that I came. He said they had prepared my favorite meal, a slow-roasted pot roast with root vegetables. The attention to detail was almost impressive. They were pulling out every single psychological stop to lower my defenses. We sat down in the formal dining room. The crystal chandelier cast a warm, inviting glow over the table. The conversation during the meal was a masterclass in manipulation. Susan and Robert spent the first 40 minutes systematically praising me. They asked about my work at the corporate auditing firm. They told me how proud they were of my work ethic. My father even raised his wine glass and offered a toast to family unity and moving forward. I smiled. I nodded. I ate the pot roast. I played the role of the eager, desperate daughter who was just so thrilled to finally be recognized. Internally, my stomach was twisting into tight, anxious knots. I knew what was resting in the drawer of my father's study. I knew that every compliment, every smile, every serving of vegetables was just a calculated stepping stone toward their ultimate goal. They were fattening the calf before the slaughter. As the dinner began to wind down, Susan smoothly transitioned the conversation. She sighed, placing her fork down with a delicate clink against her china plate. She said she felt so terribly guilty about the argument at the country club. She claimed that the stress of the logistics business had simply pushed her to her breaking point. Robert quickly jumped in right on cue. He leaned forward, adopting a serious, businesslike tone. He told me that they had been restructuring some of their commercial assets to ensure the family business remained stable. He said they wanted to make sure they never had to rely on my personal bank accounts ever again. It sounded incredibly noble, incredibly responsible. If I had not seen the forged loan application seeking $850,000 to fund Trent's failing startup, I might have felt a wave of relief. But I knew exactly what this was. The trap was opening. I kept my expression wide innocent and completely engaged. I told them I was so glad they were getting things sorted out. I told them I just wanted the business to succeed so they would not have to worry anymore. Robert smiled, a sharp, eager gleam flashing in his eyes. He said he was glad I understood. Then he smoothly stood up from the table. He said there was just one small minor piece of paperwork they needed to finalize the restructuring. He claimed it was a standard insurance update for the commercial liability policy I used to manage. He said the broker just needed my signature to officially transfer the primary contact back to his name, completely relieving me of any future financial burden. He walked down the hall to his study, the same study where I had photographed the felony wire fraud documents just 3 days prior. When he returned, he was holding a crisp, clean stack of paper attached to a thick mahogany clipboard. My heart began to hammer against my ribs, but I forced my breathing to remain slow and even. The phone in my breast pocket was recording every sound. I needed to get him to explicitly lie about the nature of the documents on tape. Robert set the clipboard down on the table, right in front of me. He placed a heavy, expensive-looking black fountain pen next to it. He pointed to the bottom of the last page, where a small yellow sticky note indicated where I needed to sign. I looked down at the document. It was exactly what I knew it would be. The final signature page of the commercial real estate collateralized loan agreement. The text on this specific page was intentionally dense, filled with standard boilerplate legal jargon that masked the true nature of the massive financial lien. To a casual observer, it might look like a standard corporate liability release. To a senior auditor, it looked like a one-way ticket to federal prison. I did not reach for his pen. Instead, I looked up at my father, projecting pure, unadulterated innocence. I asked him, making sure to speak clearly for the recording, so this is just for the commercial liability insurance on the logistics business. This just transfers the policy back into your name. Robert did not even blink. He looked me dead in the eyes and lied with absolute chilling ease. Yes, Clara, it is just a standard insurance transfer form. The broker said it needs the signature of the previous payer to authorize the change. It completely removes you from all liability moving forward. Once you sign this, you will never have to worry about our business expenses again. I looked at Susan. She was nodding encouragingly, offering me a warm maternal smile. She told me to just sign it so we could move past all the ugly financial business and go back to being a happy family. I asked one more question, ensuring the trap was perfectly secured on the audio file. I said, and this does not authorize any new loans or put any new debt in my name. I just want to be absolutely sure, Dad. My father actually chuckled, a patronizing, dismissing sound. Of course not, Clara. Do you really think your mother and I would do something like that to you? This is purely for the insurance policy. Just sign right there on the bottom line and we can finally put all this stress behind us. The sheer breathtaking audacity of his lie was staggering. They were sitting in a house they did not own, feeding me a dinner I probably paid for, smiling at me while they actively attempted to destroy my entire future. I reached into my purse. I told them I actually preferred to use my own pen. I said it was a silly habit from my auditing work, always using the same specific pen for official documents. I pulled out the blue friction erasable pen I had purchased that afternoon. Robert frowned slightly, glancing at his expensive fountain pen, but he quickly masked his irritation. He said that was perfectly fine as long as it was blue or black ink. He told me to go ahead. I uncapped the erasable pen. I positioned my hand over the signature line on the fraudulent banking document. My hand was not shaking. My mind was completely quiet. I pressed the pen to the paper and signed my name. Clara. The blue ink flowed smoothly, leaving a dark professional, absolutely perfect signature right next to the yellow sticky note. Robert immediately reached across the table and pulled the clipboard back. The palpable, overwhelming relief radiating from him was almost comical. He carefully inspected the signature, running his thumb lightly over the paper to ensure the ink was dry. Susan let out a long, heavy breath, leaning back in her chair and taking a large sip of her red wine. They had done it. They truly believed they had just successfully secured $850,000 to fund Trent's failing startup. They believed they had won. Robert thanked me. He said I had done the right thing. He told me he would drop the paperwork off at the broker first thing on Monday morning. I knew he actually meant he would drop it off at the commercial bank to initiate the fraudulent wire transfer. I capped my erasable pen and slipped it back into my purse. I smiled at them, a wide, bright, entirely fake smile. I told them I was so happy we could finally clear the air. I said I felt so much better knowing that the business was stable and that I was completely free of the financial burden. Susan stood up and began clearing the plates. The tension in the room had completely vanished, replaced by an arrogant, victorious energy. They offered me dessert. They offered me coffee. I politely declined both. I told them I had a very early morning at the auditing firm and needed to get home. Robert walked me to the front door. He patted me on the shoulder, a gesture of paternal affection that made my skin absolutely crawl. He told me to drive safe. He said he would call me later in the week to catch up properly now that all the business stress was resolved. I told him I looked forward to it. I walked out of the heavy oak front door and down the sweeping driveway toward my car. The night air was cool and crisp. I unlocked my sedan, slid into the driver's seat, and locked the doors. I immediately reached into my breast pocket and pulled out my phone. I stopped the voice recording and saved the file to 2 separate secure cloud servers. The audio was crystal clear. Every single lie, every single fraudulent assurance, every single manipulation was permanently documented. I sat in the dark car and looked back at the brightly lit house. Through the large front window, I could see Robert holding the signed document, showing it to Susan. They were laughing. They were celebrating their flawless criminal victory. They had absolutely no idea that the ink on that page was temporary. They had no idea that by Monday morning when they submitted that document to the bank, the signature would still look perfect, but the moment it was processed and scanned through the bank's high-heat document feeders, the ink would vanish into thin air. More importantly, they had no idea that Mr. Harrison had already flagged their application with the bank's fraud department. I started my engine and pulled away from the curb. The fake reconciliation was over. They had played their part perfectly, and I had played mine. I drove back toward the city, my hands steady on the steering wheel. They thought they had just secured a $1 million lifeline. They did not realize they had just tied a massive legal anchor around their own necks, and in exactly 4 days, they were going to drown. Monday morning arrived with the heavy, gray skies typical of late autumn, but I had never felt more awake. I sat at my sleek glass desk at the auditing firm, a fresh cup of dark roast coffee growing cold beside my keyboard. My computer screen was filled with standard corporate spreadsheets, but my eyes were not truly registering the numbers. My entire focus was locked on the small digital clock in the bottom right corner of my monitor. It read 9:15 in the morning. I knew my father's habits better than he knew them himself. Robert always conducted his most critical banking business right when the branch doors opened. He believed getting there early projected an image of a serious, highly motivated businessman. I knew with absolute certainty that he was currently standing in the polished lobby of that commercial bank, wearing his expensive suit, handing over a stack of documents that he believed would secure his fraudulent $850,000 loan. He believed he was saving his golden child's failing lifestyle. He had no idea he was actually handing over the final, irrefutable evidence of his own felony crimes. The waiting was the hardest part. As a senior auditor, I was accustomed to being the person actively searching for the discrepancies, digging through months of messy receipts to find the single thread that would unravel a financial crime. Today, I simply had to sit completely still and let the criminals build their own cage. Mr. Harrison had assured me the bank's fraud department was already on high alert. The senior vice president knew exactly what to look for. All I had to do was wait for the confirmation that the trap had successfully snapped shut. At exactly 10:42 in the morning, my cell phone vibrated on the glass desk. The caller identification displayed a private corporate number. I took a slow, deep breath, steadying my heart rate, and answered the call with my standard professional greeting. The voice on the other end was deep clinical and completely devoid of emotion. The caller identified himself as Investigator Davis from the commercial bank's Central Fraud Division. He stated that he was calling on the direct recommendation of Mr. Harrison regarding a pending loan application submitted under the name of Robert and Susan. He asked me to formally verify my identity for the recorded line. I provided my full legal name, my date of birth, and my social security number, my voice remaining perfectly calm and authoritative. Investigator Davis proceeded to explain exactly what had transpired at the bank branch less than an hour ago. He confirmed that Robert had personally delivered the comprehensive loan packet to a senior loan officer. The packet included the fabricated income statements, the falsified corporate liability releases, and the specific routing instructions for the disbursement of funds. Investigator Davis paused for a moment before delivering the most critical piece of information. He said the routing instructions deliberately requested the massive sum of money be wired directly to a limited liability company registered in the state of Delaware. I closed my eyes, letting a profound wave of validation wash over me. Trent's failing startup company. By requesting that the funds cross state lines, Robert and Susan had officially elevated their desperate scheme from local bank fraud to federal wire fraud. It was a severe multi-million-dollar mistake that carried mandatory minimum sentencing guidelines. But the investigator was not finished. He told me that per standard protocol, for loans exceeding $500,000, the bank required all primary authorization documents to be scanned into their central processing system. He explained that their high-speed commercial scanners utilize a thermal imaging process to verify the authenticity of watermarks on premium paper. When the loan officer ran the final signature page through the scanner, the heat from the machine triggered a complete chemical reaction in the ink. Investigator Davis cleared his throat, his professional tone softening into genuine shock. He told me that by the time the document emerged from the scanner, the signature on the bottom line had completely vanished. It was completely gone. He said the loan officer initially believed the machine had malfunctioned, but when they reviewed the physical paper, it was entirely blank. There was no trace of blue ink anywhere on the page. A cold, deeply satisfying smile formed on my face. The friction erasable pen had performed its job flawlessly. By the time Robert drove back to his sprawling suburban estate, the very document he believed secured his financial salvation was legally useless. However, Investigator Davis quickly clarified that the disappearing ink was merely the secondary trigger for their investigation. The primary trigger was the fact that the bank had already verified with the county clerk's office that the property deed was held in a blind trust and that I was the sole legal trustee. Robert had explicitly represented himself as the primary property owner on a federal application. He had submitted falsified tax returns using my stolen credentials. The bank had already compiled a massive, highly detailed digital dossier of their criminal submission. The investigator confirmed that the loan was officially flagged permanently rejected and forwarded to their internal legal compliance team for potential federal referral. I thanked Investigator Davis for his thorough work. I asked him for a certified physical copy of the final fraud report, noting that Mr. Harrison would be securing the documents for our own civil litigation. He assured me the courier was already en route to the law firm. The call ended, leaving my office in total ringing silence. It was done. The financial umbilical cord had been cut on Saturday night, but today the legal guillotine had officially dropped. My parents had crossed the line of no return. They had chosen their greed and their obsessive devotion to Emma over my safety, my career, and my freedom. They had assumed I would just be their silent, compliant victim forever. They were terribly, catastrophically wrong. I gathered my coat and my purse, logged out of my computer, and left the auditing firm. I did not care that it was the middle of the workday. I had a much more important audit to finalize. I drove straight downtown through the bustling city traffic, my mind completely clear. I was navigating toward Mr. Harrison's office, ready to prepare the final act of this meticulously orchestrated play. The heavy glass doors of the law firm opened smoothly. The receptionist nodded to me and immediately guided me back to the corner office. Mr. Harrison was already standing behind his large mahogany desk. He did not look like a grandfather today. He looked like a veteran general standing over a map of a conquered territory. Spread out across the polished wood surface were multiple stacks of heavy legal paper, each one representing a different pillar of my parents' impending destruction. He looked up as I entered and offered a short, sharp nod. "The courier arrived 10 minutes ago," he said, gesturing to a thick folder with the commercial bank's official logo stamped across the front. "We have everything. The bank has officially classified the submission as a coordinated federal fraud attempt. Your parents are completely locked in." I walked over to the desk and looked down at the documents. It was breathtaking to see 28 years of emotional abuse, financial exploitation, and blatant favoritism translated into cold, irrefutable legal paperwork. Mr. Harrison picked up the first stack of papers. "This is the original deed to the estate," he said, his voice carrying a deeply satisfying gravity. "It clearly establishes your absolute ownership and your right to dictate the terms of tenancy." He placed it carefully into the center of the desk. He picked up the second stack. "These are the formal eviction notices. Because they attempted to leverage your property to commit a felony, you are completely within your rights to demand an expedited vacancy. They have exactly 72 hours to remove their personal belongings from your house, or they will be escorted off the premises by local law enforcement." He placed the eviction notices directly on top of the deed. Finally, he picked up the third and thickest stack of papers. "This is the complete financial and criminal dossier. It contains the high-resolution photographs you took of the forged documents, the audio transcript of Robert explicitly lying to you at dinner, the bank's official fraud rejection notice, and a drafted civil lawsuit demanding immediate repayment of the hundreds of thousands of dollars they unlawfully extracted from you over the past 8 years. Mr. Harrison looked me directly in the eyes. "If they attempt to fight the eviction, if they try to cause a public scene, or if they dare to slander your name to your extended family, we simply forward this entire folder to the federal prosecutor's office. We hold their absolute ruin in our hands. They will have no choice but to surrender completely." I stared at the mountain of paper. It felt like I was looking at a mirror, reflecting a version of myself I had never met before. The weak, desperate daughter who just wanted to be invited to the family vacation was completely gone. The woman who paid for luxury cars she was never allowed to drive was dead. I was the architect of my own justice now. Mr. Harrison reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a single heavy cream-colored envelope. It was thick and lined with a sophisticated security pattern. He carefully gathered the deed, the eviction notices, and the summary pages of the fraud dossier. He slid all the documents into the envelope. He folded the thick flap over and sealed it with absolute precision. He placed the sealed envelope in the exact center of his mahogany desk. "Now," he said quietly, "we just need to get them into this room." I picked up my cell phone. My hands were completely steady. I navigated to my contacts and found my mother's name. I had ignored her frantic messages all weekend. I knew she was currently sitting in her lavish living room staring at her phone, absolutely desperate for a status update on her $1,000,000 lifeline. I pressed the call button and put the phone on speaker, placing it on the desk right next to the sealed envelope. The phone rang only twice before Susan picked up. "Clara," she answered breathlessly, her voice tight with thinly veiled anxiety. "Have you heard anything? Did Robert drop the papers off correctly? Is the insurance update finalized?" She was still aggressively maintaining the lie. Even now, believing she had successfully stolen my identity, she was still playing the role of the innocent, stressed mother. I let a small, warm tone enter my voice. I sounded helpful, compliant, and perfectly oblivious. "Yes," I said smoothly. "The bank received the paperwork this morning." I heard a massive, shuddering sigh of relief echo through the speaker. Oh, thank goodness, Susan breathed. We were so worried there might be a delay. Trent has some very important vendors he needs to pay by Friday. That money is going to save his company. She was so incredibly arrogant that she openly admitted the true purpose of the funds right on the recorded line. She truly believed I was too stupid to understand what she was talking about. I kept my voice perfectly even. Actually, the bank manager called me a little while ago. Because of the size of the policy restructuring, they require all the primary parties to sit down together to finalize the transfer and formally release the funds. My legal counsel, Mr. Harrison, has agreed to host the meeting to ensure all the paperwork is perfectly compliant. We need you, Dad, Emma, and Trent to come down to his office on Friday afternoon. Once we review the final packet, the bank will officially release everything. There was a brief pause on the line. I could hear her mentally calculating the logistics. Friday is perfect, she said, her voice dripping with sudden, overwhelming greed. Trent can show the vendors the pending transfer approval. We will all be there, Clara. Thank you so much for being so cooperative. You really are being a good daughter by helping your sister and her husband. The sheer toxicity of her compliment almost made me laugh out loud. I was only a good daughter when I was actively serving Emma's interests. I told her the address of the law firm and set the time for 2:00 in the afternoon. I told her to make sure everyone dressed professionally, as it was a highly formal legal environment. She eagerly agreed, promising they would all be there right on time. I ended the call. The silence returned to the corner office. I looked across the desk at Mr. Harrison. He was smiling a grim, deeply satisfied smile. The legal trap had just snapped completely shut. They had absolutely no idea what was waiting for them. They thought they were walking into a luxury downtown law firm to collect nearly $1 million. They thought they were going to finally secure Emma's glamorous future. They thought they had successfully manipulated the quiet, practical sister one last time. They did not know that the sealed envelope resting on that mahogany desk was the absolute end of their privileged existence. I had spent my entire life being treated like an unwanted burden, relegated to the cramped table by the kitchen doors, while my sister basked in the spotlight. But this Friday, the seating arrangement was going to be completely different. I was going to sit at the head of the table, and my family was going to finally learn the devastating cost of their cold choices. I stood up, thanked Mr. Harrison, and walked out of the office, ready for the final confrontation. Exactly 1 week had passed since I stood in the freezing rain outside the Pinecrest Country Club, staring at the glowing screen of my phone and realizing my family had never actually loved me. Exactly 1 week since my mother had looked me in the eyes and publicly declared that she wished my sister Emma was her only child. Now it was Friday afternoon, and the sky over Chicago was a brilliant, unyielding blue. I sat in a high-backed leather chair in the corner conference room of Mr. Harrison's downtown law firm. The massive floor-to-ceiling windows offered a commanding view of the city skyline, but my entire focus was locked on the heavy mahogany doors at the front of the room. My heart was not racing. My palms were not sweating. For the first time in 28 years, I felt a profound, absolute stillness in my chest. The frantic, desperate daughter who had spent nearly a decade paying mortgages, funding luxury car leases, and balancing fraudulent tax ledgers just to earn a single scrap of maternal affection was entirely gone. Sitting in that chair was a senior corporate auditor who had meticulously built an inescapable legal cage for the people who had tried to destroy her. Mr. Harrison sat at the head of the long conference table. He wore a dark, impeccably tailored suit, his silver hair perfectly combed, his piercing gray eyes focused on the single thick cream-colored envelope resting precisely in the center of the polished wood table. We had not spoken a word for the last 10 minutes. We did not need to. The trap was perfectly set. The commercial bank had already flagged my parents' forged loan application as a coordinated federal wire fraud attempt. The criminal dossier, the original property deed proving I was the sole owner of their estate, and the 72-hour eviction notices were all securely sealed inside that envelope. All we had to do now was wait for the criminals to walk into the room and claim their prize. At exactly 2:00 in the afternoon, the heavy mahogany doors swung open. My family walked into the conference room like they were stepping onto a red carpet. The sheer breathtaking arrogance radiating from them was almost suffocating. They truly believed they had won. They believed that the forged signature I had cleverly penned with disappearing ink had successfully cleared the bank's underwriting department. They believed they were walking into this prestigious law firm simply to collect a cashier's check for $850,000. My mother, Susan, led the procession. She was wearing a brand new cream-colored silk pantsuit and a string of heavy pearls, carrying a designer handbag that cost more than my first car. She looked around the opulent boardroom with a wide, victorious smile, completely misinterpreting the setting as a reflection of her own elevated social status. She honestly thought she belonged in a room like this. My father, Robert, followed closely behind her. He walked with an exaggerated swagger, his chest puffed out, holding a slim leather briefcase that I knew for a fact was completely empty. He immediately walked over to Mr. Harrison and extended his hand, aggressively deploying a fake, overly familiar corporate charm. He thanked Mr. Harrison for facilitating the transfer, speaking in loud, booming tones about how exhausting the real estate logistics business could be, and how nice it was to finally get this minor paperwork out of the way. Mr. Harrison did not smile. He simply stood up, shook Robert's hand with a grip made of absolute iron, and gestured for everyone to take their seats. Then came Emma and her husband Trent. Emma looked like she was arriving at a luxury spa rather than a legal proceeding. She wore a bright floral sundress and oversized designer sunglasses, pushed back into her perfectly styled blonde hair. Trent walked beside her, practically vibrating with unearned confidence. He was already talking loudly on his cell phone as he entered the room, loudly telling whoever was on the other end of the line that his capital injection had finally cleared and that they could begin the aggressive expansion of his technology startup by Monday morning. He snapped his phone shut, slid into one of the expensive leather chairs, and leaned back thoughtfully with his hands clasped behind his head. He looked at me, offered a lazy, condescending half-smile, and asked if we could speed this up because he had a tea time booked at the club for 4 o'clock. I looked at the four of them sitting across the vast expanse of the mahogany table. They looked so incredibly smug. They looked so completely secure in their delusion. They had spent my entire life treating me like a disposable utility, a quiet, boring workhorse whose only purpose was to finance their extravagant vanity. They had forged my name on federal banking documents to steal nearly $1 million against a house they did not even own, firmly believing I was too timid and too desperate for their love to ever fight back. I kept my hands folded neatly in my lap. I did not glare at them. I did not frown. I maintained the exact same neutral professional expression I used when informing a corporate client that their business was officially bankrupt. Mr. Harrison cleared his throat, the sound instantly bringing the room to order. He remained standing at the head of the table. He looked at my father and stated in a cold, clinical tone that we were here today to finalize the transition of assets and liabilities regarding the commercial real estate collateralized loan agreement. He asked Robert to confirm that this was his understanding of the meeting. Robert nodded eagerly, leaning forward and resting his elbows on the table. He said yes, absolutely. He stated that all the necessary signatures had been provided at the family dinner earlier in the week, and that they were simply here to receive the final bank authorization and execute the wire transfer into Trent's corporate holding account. He looked at me and offered a patronizing, entirely fake smile, telling Mr. Harrison that I had been incredibly cooperative in helping the family restructure their financial obligations. Susan could not resist taking the opportunity to insert herself into the spotlight. She sat up, perfectly straight, smoothing the lapels of her silk suit. She looked at Mr. Harrison, then turned her gaze directly to me. The fake maternal warmth she had weaponized during our reconciliation dinner completely vanished. Now that she believed the money was fully secured, now that she believed the massive loan was sitting safely in the bank's escrow account ready to be wired, she dropped the loving mother act entirely. The heavy oak doors of the boardroom were securely closed. There were no wealthy neighbors or country club friends around to witness her behavior. There was no need to pretend anymore. Susan looked me dead in the eyes, her expression hardening into something exceptionally cold and cruel. She told me that since we were finalizing all the legal and financial ties today, it was time to be completely honest about our arrangement moving forward. She spoke in a calm, measured voice, explaining her cruelty as if it were simply a matter of basic household accounting. She said that for the past 8 years, my presence in their lives had become increasingly difficult to manage. She claimed that I was constantly projecting a miserable, exhausting energy that dragged the entire family down. She explicitly stated that my complete lack of social grace and my boring, rigid personality were a constant source of embarrassment whenever they had to introduce me to important people. She gestured casually toward Emma, her golden child, and told me that Emma and Trent were building a vibrant, successful future that required the family's undivided focus and complete emotional support. I sat perfectly still, recording every single word in my mind. She was actively justifying why she was cutting me out of her life, completely oblivious to the fact that I was the only reason she was not currently living in a cheap motel. Susan leaned slightly across the table, her eyes narrowing. She told me that she meant every single word she had said at the anniversary party last week. She said that once this massive bank transfer cleared today and Trent's business was fully funded, they would no longer require my assistance with the logistics business, the house, or the auto leases. She formally announced that they were officially releasing me from the family. She took a slow breath, raising her chin with absolute, unapologetic arrogance. She told me that it was time for us to go our separate ways. She repeated the exact insult that had shattered my heart 7 days ago, only this time she said it with total victorious finality. Once this money hits Trent's account today, Susan said, her voice dripping with venomous satisfaction, you and I are done. We have the daughter we always wanted. Emma is the only child we need to focus on from this moment forward. I suggest you move on with your life, Clara, because you are no longer a part of ours. The silence that followed her declaration was absolute. The sheer breathtaking malice of her statement hung heavy in the conditioned air of the boardroom. She had just used me to secure what she believed was nearly $1 million in fraudulent cash, and her immediate response was to look me in the eye and throw me away like a broken tool. I looked at Robert. He was looking out the window, cowardly refusing to make eye contact, silently co-signing his wife's horrific cruelty. I looked at Trent. He was picking at his fingernails, looking completely bored by the emotional display, only caring about how fast the money would hit his account. And then I looked at Emma, my younger sister, the girl I had sacrificed my own youth and savings to support. Emma shifted in her heavy leather chair, crossing her arms over her floral dress. She looked right at me. She did not look sympathetic. She did not look guilty. She looked directly into my eyes and she smirked. It was the exact same arrogant, victorious smirk she had worn at the country club. She leaned her head onto Trent's shoulder, letting out a soft, dismissive sigh, clearly waiting for me to burst into tears and run out of the room so they could finally collect their check. But I did not cry. I did not scream. I did not beg for them to love me. I simply looked at the woman who had given birth to me, the woman who had just gleefully severed our relationship forever, and I felt a deep, overwhelming surge of glorious freedom. I leaned forward slightly, resting my forearms on the cool mahogany table. I kept my voice incredibly calm, completely drained of any sorrow or anger. I spoke with the precise, detached authority of a senior auditor, concluding a massive corporate investigation. I looked directly at Susan and told her that I completely understood. I told her that I agreed with her assessment entirely. I explicitly stated that our financial and emotional arrangement was permanently over, and I agreed that from this exact second forward, she and Robert should absolutely focus all of their time, energy, and resources exclusively on Emma. Susan blinked, clearly taken aback by my total lack of resistance. She had expected a hysterical meltdown. She had expected me to plead for my place in the family. My cold, instant agreement threw her off balance for a fraction of a second, but her overwhelming greed quickly smothered her confusion. She recovered her posture, offering a tight, patronizing nod of approval. She told me she was glad I was finally choosing to be practical and mature about the situation. Robert aggressively cleared his throat, eager to move past the family drama and get his hands on the cash. He turned his attention back to the head of the table. He clapped his hands together, once rubbing them in anticipation. He told Mr. Harrison that since we were all on the same page and the family business was officially concluded, it was time to review the final bank confirmation. He explicitly demanded the wire transfer release codes so Trent could notify his vendors that the money was actively in transit. Mr. Harrison did not reach for a bank confirmation. He did not pull out a wire transfer receipt. His piercing gray eyes flicked from Robert to Susan and finally rested on me. He gave me a single, almost imperceptible nod. The time for waiting was over. I reached out and placed my right hand on the thick cream-colored envelope resting in the exact center of the table. The heavy paper contained the explosive truth. The original property deed proving they were mere tenants in my house. The 72-hour eviction notices that would render them completely homeless by Monday, and the massive, heavily documented fraud dossier directly from the commercial bank's Federal Compliance Department, detailing their felony forgery and wire fraud attempts. I kept my hand flat against the envelope. I looked at my parents, who were watching my hand with hungry, desperate eyes, truly believing that envelope contained their financial salvation. I looked at Trent, who had finally sat up straight, his eyes locked on the paper. With a slow, deliberate, and perfectly smooth motion, I pushed the sealed envelope across the polished mahogany wood. It glided silently across the long table, coming to a stop directly in front of Susan and Robert. Emma leaned forward, looking down at the heavy envelope. She rolled her eyes dramatically, letting out a sharp, incredibly loud, mocking laugh that echoed off the glass walls of the boardroom. She threw her hands up in the air in an exaggerated display of annoyance. She scoffed loudly, asking why I always had to be so ridiculously theatrical. She mockingly asked why I could not just hand over a simple bank receipt like a normal person, instead of sliding sealed envelopes across the table like I was in some cheap spy movie. I did not break eye contact with my sister. My face remained an absolute mask of stone. I listened to her mocking laughter fill the room, knowing it would be the very last time she would ever laugh at my expense. I kept my voice deathly quiet, making sure the words carried clearly across the table. I told Emma to go ahead and laugh. I told her to laugh as loud and as hard as she possibly could right now, because once Mr. Harrison broke the seal on that envelope, she was never going to smile again. Mr. Harrison reached out with a slow, deliberate grace. He picked up a heavy silver letter opener from his desk organizer. The room was so incredibly quiet that the sharp slicing sound of the blade cutting through the thick paper of the sealed envelope echoed clearly off the glass walls. My mother, Susan, let out a short, impatient sigh. She shifted in her seat, adjusting her pearl necklace, her eyes glued to the opening of the envelope. She was waiting for a transfer confirmation. She was waiting for a massive check. She was waiting for the keys to a financial kingdom she felt entirely entitled to. Instead, Mr. Harrison pulled out a dense, heavy stack of crisp white legal documents. There was no bank check. There was no congratulatory letter from a commercial loan officer. There was only a mountain of highly sensitive, thoroughly verified evidence. The smug, victorious smile on my father's face began to falter just a fraction. Robert leaned forward, squinting slightly, trying desperately to read the upside-down text on the very top page. Trent checked his expensive watch, loudly tapping his fingers against the mahogany table, completely oblivious to the fact that his entire world was about to violently collapse. Emma sat beside him, still wearing that arrogant smirk, waiting for me to be put in my place. Mr. Harrison placed the stack of papers flat on the center of the desk. He took a moment to adjust his reading glasses, his expression entirely devoid of warmth or sympathy. He looked directly at my father and stated that before any financial disbursements could be discussed, the firm needed to formally clarify the legal standing of the collateral used for the loan application. Robert aggressively cleared his throat, sitting up perfectly straight to project authority. He told Mr. Harrison that the collateral was the family estate, which was entirely unencumbered and owned free and clear by him and his wife. He said it with such absolute conviction that for a second, I wondered if he had actually convinced himself the lie was true. Mr. Harrison did not smile. He simply picked up the first document from the stack. He announced that he was holding the original certified property deed for the sprawling suburban estate they currently occupied. He began to read the legal text aloud, his voice booming across the quiet conference room. He read the exact clauses established by my late grandfather Thomas. He read the clear, undeniable legal provision stating that the property was held in a secure blind trust. And then he read the final line of the deed, confirming that upon my 25th birthday, the sole undisputed legal owner and trustee of the entire property was Clara. The color instantly drained from my mother's face. Her mouth opened, but absolutely no sound came out. Robert slammed his hand down on the mahogany table. He shouted that there had to be some kind of mistake. He claimed that he had been paying the mortgage on that house for 8 years and that he had built equity in the property. I looked at my father, my voice completely flat and devoid of emotion. I told him he had never paid a single dime toward that mortgage in his entire life. I told him that I had been paying the $3,500 monthly mortgage using my own corporate salary every single month for 8 long years. I had paid the property taxes. I had paid the maintenance. They were legally nothing more than tenants living in my house, completely rent-free. Emma whipped her head around to look at her parents, her designer sunglasses slipping down her nose. She looked at her father, sheer panic suddenly replacing her arrogant smirk. She asked him if what I was saying was true. She asked him if they did not actually own the massive house she had been bragging about to Trent's wealthy family for the past 3 years. Robert could not answer her. He just sat there, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. Mr. Harrison did not give them a single moment to recover. He picked up the next document from the stack and slid it across the table directly in front of Susan and Robert. He announced that it was a formal, legally binding 72-hour notice of eviction. He explained that because they had severely violated the terms of their tenancy by attempting to leverage the property for an unauthorized commercial loan, their right to reside in the home was permanently terminated. He told them they had exactly 3 days to pack their personal belongings and vacate the premises, or they would be forcibly removed by local law enforcement. Susan shot to her feet, her chair scraping loudly against the hardwood floor. She screamed that this was an absolute outrage. She pointed a trembling finger at me, her face flushed with furious indignation. She demanded to know how I could do this to my own family. She said I was a monster for trying to throw my own parents out onto the street. I did not flinch. I looked at the woman who had publicly wished I did not exist just 7 days ago. I reminded her that she was the one who said she only wanted one child. I told her that she was finally getting exactly what she asked for, and that she should ask her golden child where they were going to sleep on Monday night. Before Susan could launch into another screaming fit, Mr. Harrison raised his hand, commanding total silence. He picked up the third document. This one featured the bold, unmistakable logo of the commercial bank they had visited on Monday morning. It was not a loan approval. It was a formal fraud rejection notice from the bank's Federal Compliance Division. Mr. Harrison began to read the details of their submission. He read the exact requested loan amount of $850,000. He read the fabricated income statements they had submitted using my stolen credentials as a senior auditor. Then he read the specific wire routing instructions. He stated clearly for the entire room to hear that Robert and Susan had directed the massive sum of money to be deposited into a limited liability company registered in the state of Delaware, an entity owned entirely by Trent. Trent suddenly sat up so fast he nearly knocked over his water glass. The lazy bored posture completely vanished. He looked at Mr. Harrison, his eyes wide with genuine terror. He realized in that exact moment that his name and his failing business were officially linked to a massive federal banking crime. He began to aggressively shake his head, muttering that he had absolutely no idea what they were talking about, and that he thought my parents were securing a standard business loan. Mr. Harrison ignored Trent's panic. He continued reading the bank's official report. He explained that the bank required all primary authorization documents to be processed through their high-heat thermal imaging scanners to verify the security watermarks. He looked directly at Robert and explained that when the loan officer scanned the final signature page, the one containing my forged authorization, the heat from the machine triggered a complete chemical reaction. He revealed that the blue ink had vanished entirely, leaving a perfectly blank signature line. Robert started stammering uncontrollably. He looked at me, his eyes wide with a mixture of horror and realization. He stuttered that I had signed it right in front of him at the dining room table. He insisted that he had watched me write my name with his own 2 eyes. I leaned forward, resting my arms on the table. I told him I had signed it using a premium friction erasable pen. I explained that the ink was specifically designed to disappear without a single trace the moment it was exposed to high heat. I told my father that I knew exactly what he was trying to do. I knew he was actively trying to commit major bank fraud, and I intentionally let him walk right into a federal trap. Susan collapsed back into her heavy leather chair. Her face was no longer red. It was a sickly, pale gray. She looked at me as if she were looking at a complete stranger. She finally realized that the quiet, compliant daughter she had abused for nearly 3 decades had systematically engineered their absolute destruction. Mr. Harrison delivered the final, devastating blow. He pulled out the last stack of papers. He announced that he had personally drafted comprehensive criminal referrals for federal wire fraud, aggravated identity theft, and attempted bank fraud. He stated that the commercial bank already possessed the entire digital dossier of their criminal submission. He explained the mandatory minimum sentencing guidelines for federal financial crimes of this magnitude. He told them that if these documents were forwarded to the Federal Bureau of Investigation, Robert and Susan would undoubtedly face significant prison time, and Trent would be deeply investigated as a primary co-conspirator. The silence in the boardroom was absolute and terrifying. The arrogant, wealthy facade my family had worn into the room had been completely stripped away, leaving only 4 desperate, terrified people staring at the very real possibility of total ruin. Emma was no longer smirking. She was gripping the edge of the table, her knuckles white, her breathing shallow and erratic. She looked at Trent for support, but Trent was physically leaning away from her, his eyes darting toward the heavy mahogany exit doors, like a trapped animal calculating his escape route. I stood up slowly from my chair. I looked down at the people who had treated me like disposable trash for my entire life. I did not raise my voice. I spoke with the cold, absolute authority of someone holding all the cards. I told them I was giving them exactly 1 cinematic ultimatum, and they had exactly 60 seconds to accept the terms before I instructed Mr. Harrison to make the phone call to the federal prosecutor's office. I laid out my demands with flawless precision. First, they would surrender all claims to the suburban estate and vacate the premises within the original 72-hour window. They would leave the property in pristine condition, taking only their personal clothing and basic necessities. Second, they would immediately surrender the 2 luxury vehicles back to the leasing company and absorb the massive early termination penalties themselves. I was no longer funding their fake wealthy lifestyle. Third, and most importantly, I demanded they sign over total ownership of their failing logistics business directly to me. I explained that I was going to systematically liquidate every single remaining asset, sell the company trucks, and close the warehouse to recoup the hundreds of thousands of dollars they had functionally stolen from me over the past 8 years. They would walk away from this room with absolutely nothing. No house, no cars, no business, no money. I looked at my mother. Her eyes were brimming with tears of sheer panic. I told her that if they agreed to my terms and signed the surrender documents right now, I would quietly pack up the fraud dossier and keep it locked in Mr. Harrison's vault. I would let them walk out of this law firm as free, albeit entirely bankrupt citizens. But if they argued, if they hesitated, or if they ever tried to contact me again for the rest of their natural lives, I would personally hand-deliver the forged loan application and the secret audio recordings to the federal authorities. I pulled my phone from my pocket and set a timer for 60 seconds. I placed the phone gently on the mahogany table. The digital numbers began to count down in total silence. 59, 58, 57. Robert looked at Susan, his face utterly defeated. The proud, arrogant patriarch was gone, replaced by a terrified, broken old man who finally understood that he had lost everything. He looked at the timer, then looked at Mr. Harrison. His hands were shaking so violently, he had to press them flat against the table to steady himself. Susan opened her mouth, a pathetic, desperate sob escaping her throat. She begged me to reconsider. She cried that I was their daughter and that families do not do this to each other. She pleaded that they would be completely homeless and ruined. I looked at the timer, 30 seconds. I stared directly into my mother's weeping eyes and told her that she made her choice at the country club. I reminded her that she had wished for only one child. I told her that she was simply facing the consequences of getting exactly what she asked for. 15 seconds. Mr. Harrison slid a stack of asset surrender contracts across the table, along with a standard blue ink pen. He explicitly noted that this pen was not erasable. 10 seconds. Trent abruptly stood up his chair, crashing backward onto the floor. He looked at Emma, his face contorted with panic and anger. He told her he was not going to federal prison for her psychotic parents. He told her he was done. He turned his back on my sister and practically ran out of the boardroom, abandoning her completely. Emma let out a horrific, shattering scream, burying her face in her hands. 5 seconds. Robert snatched the blue pen from the table. He pulled the surrender contracts toward him and began signing his name with frantic, desperate speed. He signed away the business. He signed the eviction acknowledgement. He shoved the papers toward Susan, screaming at her to sign them before I ruined them completely. Susan picked up the pen. Her tears fell onto the crisp legal paper, staining the ink as she signed away her entire life. When she finished, she dropped the pen on the table. It rolled to a stop right next to my phone. The timer hit 0. I picked up my phone and turned off the alarm. I looked at the signed contracts, confirming that every signature was perfectly in place. I looked at my family one last time. They were broken weeping and entirely destroyed by their own greed. I felt a profound, beautiful sense of closure wash over my entire soul. The long nightmare of my financial and emotional servitude was officially over. I turned my back on them, thanked Mr. Harrison for his excellent work, and walked out of the boardroom without saying another word. The silence that blanketed the conference room was no longer the heavy, anticipatory quiet of a high-stakes business deal. It was the suffocating, ringing silence of total devastation. My father had just frantically signed away everything he owned to avoid federal prison. My mother was weeping openly, her tears staining the crisp legal documents that stripped them of their home and their business. But the true explosion, the one that finally shattered the glittering facade of this family forever, did not come from my parents. It came from Trent. Trent had been sitting rigidly in his expensive leather chair, his eyes darting frantically between the signed surrender contracts and Mr. Harrison. For 3 years, Trent had played the role of the brilliant upcoming tech entrepreneur. He had paraded around the country club, ordering expensive bottles of wine on my father's tab, loudly bragging about his visionary startup company that was always just one capital injection away from revolutionizing the industry. He had treated me like a lowly servant, snapping his fingers at me to refill his drink at family dinners. Now, the absolute reality of his situation crashed down upon him with the force of a freight train. There was no massive commercial loan. There was no cashier check for $850,000. The money he desperately needed to pay off his aggressive vendors and keep his fraudulent company afloat simply did not exist. Worse than the lack of funds was the terrifying revelation that my parents had used his Delaware-based limited liability company as the receiving account for a forged federal wire transfer. Trent abruptly stood up. The heavy leather chair screeched violently against the polished hardwood floor, the sound slicing through the quiet room like a knife. He did not look at my father, who was still hunched over the mahogany table in defeat. He did not look at my mother, who was sobbing into her hands. He looked directly down at my sister Emma. Emma reached up toward him, her hands trembling. Her perfect glossy blowout was slightly messy now. Her oversized designer sunglasses lay forgotten on the table. She looked at her husband with absolute pathetic desperation. She called his name, her voice high and tight with panic. She begged him to sit back down. She told him that her father would fix this. She told him that Robert always had a backup plan and that they just needed to figure out a new strategy to get the money. Trent looked down at her, and the expression on his face was one of pure, unadulterated disgust. The charming, loving smile he always wore for the family photos was completely gone. In its place was the cold, calculating glare of a cornered animal. He violently slapped her hands away. He yelled at her, his voice echoing off the glass walls of the boardroom. He told her she was completely delusional. He screamed that her father was not a wealthy businessman, but a broke, fraudulent criminal who had just implicated him in a massive federal investigation. Trent paced back and forth behind his chair, his hands gripping his hair in panic. He yelled that he had only married into this family because Robert had promised to completely fund his startup. He said he had put up with Emma's endless shopping, her whining, and her absolute uselessness because he believed there was a massive inheritance waiting for him. Emma physically recoiled as if she had been struck across the face. She let out a horrific, breathless gasp. She stared at the man she had proudly claimed was the love of her life, suddenly realizing that their entire marriage was nothing more than a transactional grift. She whispered that they were supposed to be a team. Trent laughed. It was a harsh barking sound, completely devoid of humor. He leaned down, bringing his face inches from hers. He told her there was no team. He told her she was a spoiled, empty shell of a person who brought absolutely nothing of value to his life. He said that without her parents, money, she was entirely worthless to him. He explicitly stated that he was not going to spend the best years of his life rotting in a federal white-collar prison just to cover up the crimes of her pathetic, bankrupt parents. Trent did not wait for her to respond. He grabbed his cell phone from the table, turned his back on my sister, and marched directly toward the heavy mahogany exit doors. Robert weakly called out to him, using the word son, pleading with him to wait so they could discuss a legal defense strategy. Trent did not even break his stride. He threw open the boardroom doors and practically sprinted down the hallway, fleeing the sinking ship as fast as his expensive Italian loafers could carry him. Emma let out a shattering, agonizing wail. It was the sound of her entire golden, privileged universe collapsing into ash. She turned to my father, grabbing the lapels of his suit, shaking him with frantic energy. She demanded that he call Trent back. She screamed that he had ruined her life. She cried that her marriage was over, and that it was all his fault for being so stupid with the loan application. Robert could not even lift his head to look his favorite daughter in the eyes. The man who had spent decades dictating orders, controlling the narrative, and demanding absolute respect from me was reduced to a hollow, trembling shell. He just stared at the legal documents in front of him, fully realizing that he had sacrificed his own daughter, his business, and his home, all for absolutely nothing. The chaos of Emma's breakdown filled the room, but I remained perfectly still in my high-backed leather chair. I felt a profound, untouchable calm radiating through my entire body. For 28 years, I had believed that I was the problem. I had believed that if I just worked harder, if I just paid one more bill, if I just balanced one more messy ledger, they would finally see my value. Watching the absolute destruction of their fake empire, I finally understood that their lack of love had nothing to do with me. They were simply selfish, hollow people who consumed everything around them until there was nothing left. The reality of their impending homelessness and total financial ruin finally pierced through Susan's shock. My mother slowly raised her head from her hands. She looked at the empty space where Trent had been standing. She looked at Emma, who was sobbing hysterically onto the table, and then she looked across the long mahogany expanse directly at me. Susan stood up on shaky legs. She walked around the edge of the table, her steps slow and hesitant. The arrogant, cruel woman who had gleefully told me she was cutting me out of the family just 30 minutes ago was entirely gone. In her place was a terrified, desperate stranger. She stood up on shaky legs. She walked around the large conference table, her hands outstretched toward me, like a beggar pleading for scraps. "Clara," she whimpered, her voice cracking with manufactured sorrow. "Clara, please, you have to listen to me." I did not say a word. I simply looked at her, and my face a neutral, unreadable mask. Mr. Harrison sat quietly beside me, his hands folded, watching the pathetic display with cold, professional detachment. Susan began to beg. She threw away every ounce of her remaining pride and pleaded for mercy. She said that she knew she had made terrible mistakes. She claimed that the stress of the business and the fear of losing their status in the community had driven her to a state of absolute madness. She swore that she never actually intended to hurt me and that the forged loan document was just a desperate temporary measure. She tried to play the ultimate card of maternal manipulation. She cried that she was the woman who gave me life, that she had rocked me when I was a baby, and that families do not destroy each other over money. Robert joined her, shuffling around the table to stand by her side. He looked at me with red, watery eyes. He begged me to keep the logistics business. He said I could own it entirely, but he pleaded with me to let him stay on as an employee. He promised he would work for minimum wage. He promised he would answer to me. He just begged me not to take the house. He said they had nowhere to go. He asked if they could just live in the small guest wing over the garage, promising they would never bother me, promising they would finally treat me with the respect I deserved. I sat and listened to them exhaust their supply of desperate lies and pathetic bargains. I let them debase themselves. I wanted to hear every single excuse they had to offer, just so I could be absolutely certain that there was not a single shred of genuine redemption left in their souls. They were not apologizing because they felt remorse for treating me terribly. They were not apologizing because they felt guilty about attempting federal wire fraud. They were only begging because they had been caught, and because I was the only person standing between them and the absolute ruin of the street. When they finally stopped talking, the room fell silent again, save for Emma's quiet, miserable sobbing in the background. My parents stood before me, waiting for a pardon they did not earn. I leaned forward slightly, resting my hands on the polished wood of the table. I looked directly into my mother's eyes. I did not raise my voice. I spoke with a quiet, undeniable clarity that left absolutely no room for negotiation. I told Susan that she did not get to invoke the sacred bond of family today. I reminded her of the dinner at the Pinecrest Country Club. I painted the picture for her perfectly. I reminded her of how I sat at that table exhausted from working 60-hour weeks to keep their fraudulent company from sinking, only to have her look me in the eyes in front of 30 people and tell me I was a disappointment. I reminded her of the exact words she used. I told Robert that I would never hire a man who was willing to forge his own daughter's signature on a federal banking document. I told him that he was not a businessman, but a common thief who just happened to wear expensive suits. I explicitly stated that I would rather burn the logistics business to the ground and sell the ashes than ever let him step foot inside my company again. Susan reached out her trembling fingers, hovering just inches from my arm. She cried that I was being cruel. She sobbed that I was completely destroying my own family and that I would regret this for the rest of my life. She asked me how I could live with myself, knowing that my parents and my sister had absolutely nothing. I stood up slowly, rising to my full height. The heavy leather chair slid back silently. I looked down at the woman who had spent my entire life making me feel like an unwanted ghost in my own home. I looked at the tears streaming down her face, and I felt absolutely nothing but a profound, liberating peace. I gathered my purse and slung the strap over my shoulder. I looked my mother dead in the eyes and delivered the final, absolute truth of our existence. "You told me at the country club that you wished Emma was your only child," I said, my voice steady, cold, and ringing with total finality. "You told me again in this very room just 30 minutes ago that you were officially cutting me out so you could focus entirely on her." I paused, letting the silence amplify the devastating weight of my words. "You have your wish," I told her. "Emma is your only child now. Good luck to all three of you." Susan let out a sharp, breathless gasp, taking a physical step backward, as if the words had actually struck her. Robert buried his face in his hands, letting out a low, defeated groan. Emma just continued to weep silently at the far end of the table, entirely broken, entirely alone despite sitting in the same room as her parents. Mr. Harrison stood up beside me. He gathered the thick stack of signed surrender documents, tapping the edges neatly against the mahogany table to align the pages. He slipped the documents safely into his leather briefcase and snapped the golden locks shut. The sharp metallic click echoed like a judge's gavel, signaling the absolute end of the trial. He looked at my parents one final time. He informed them that the eviction timer had officially started. He reminded them that local law enforcement would arrive at the estate exactly 72 hours from this moment to oversee their departure, and he strongly advised them to begin packing immediately. He offered no pleasantries. He offered no farewell. I turned my back on my family. I did not look over my shoulder as I walked toward the heavy mahogany doors. The sound of my practical heels clicking against the hardwood floor felt like the steady rhythm of a ticking clock, counting down the final seconds of their fake, privileged lives. Mr. Harrison opened the door for me, and I stepped out into the quiet, carpeted hallway of the law firm. As the heavy doors slowly swung shut behind us, cutting off the sound of my mother's desperate weeping and my sister's shattered cries, I took a deep, cleansing breath of the conditioned air. The crushing, suffocating weight I had carried on my shoulders for 8 long years was completely miraculously gone. I had walked into that boardroom as an unwanted daughter. I was walking out as a free, independent, and incredibly wealthy woman. I stepped onto the elevator beside Mr. Harrison. The door slid closed, sealing away the ruined remnants of my past. I pressed the button for the lobby, ready to step out into the bright, unyielding sunlight of my brand new life. 6 months have passed since that Friday afternoon in Mr. Harrison's office. Sometimes I still wake up in the morning and wait for the familiar weight of anxiety to crush my chest. I wait for the demanding text messages from my mother, complaining about a declined credit card. I wait for the urgent emails from my father asking me to fix their latest financial disaster before the bank opens. But my phone remains perfectly quiet. The silence used to terrify me because I was so conditioned to living in constant chaos. Now that silence is the most beautiful and comforting sound in the entire world. Last week, I officially closed the final chapter on my late grandfather's estate. The sprawling suburban mansion, the one my parents had used as their personal country club stage to project wealth and status for nearly a decade, sold to a lovely young family for a massive profit. The real estate market in that specific neighborhood was incredibly favorable, and because the property was completely unencumbered thanks to Mr. Harrison's swift and aggressive legal action, the sale moved incredibly fast. I walked through those empty mahogany rooms one final time before handing over the keys to the real estate agent. Without my mother's expensive imported furniture and my father's arrogant, booming presence echoing off the walls, the house just looked like a normal, empty building. It held absolutely no power over me anymore. The ghosts of my miserable childhood, the constant echoes of being told I was not quite enough, the phantom weight of my sisters, endless mocking laughter, they were all completely gone. I locked the heavy oak front door for the very last time, walked to my car, and I did not look back even once as I drove away from that life forever. As for Robert and Susan, their new reality is a harsh, brutal contrast to the glittering illusion they spent their entire lives desperately trying to maintain. The 72-hour eviction notice we served them in the boardroom was executed flawlessly. Local law enforcement arrived exactly on time that Monday morning to ensure they vacated the premises without causing any damage to my property. They had to leave behind the luxury vehicles because I immediately canceled the auto leases and refused to pay the early termination fees. They walked out of my grandfather's house with nothing but their suitcases, a few boxes of cheap personal items, and the crushing, undeniable realization that their fake empire had completely collapsed. The civil lawsuit Mr. Harrison filed against them for the hundreds of thousands of dollars they unlawfully extracted from my accounts over the past 8 years drained whatever pathetic hidden savings they had managed to stash away. Today, my parents are living in a cramped 2-bedroom rental apartment on the far industrial side of the city. It is a noisy, rundown neighborhood they used to openly mock during their lavish Sunday brunches at the country club. Without my steady, reliable income to secretly fund their delusions, they were forced to face actual economic reality. Robert, the man who used to strut around the golf course acting like a corporate titan, is now working an exhausting entry-level job as a shift supervisor at a regional shipping warehouse. He clocks in at 5 in the morning and works grueling 50-hour weeks on his feet just to make enough money to pay his rent and keep the lights on. Susan, the incredibly vain woman who would rather die than be seen wearing an out-of-season dress, was forced to take a job as a front desk receptionist at a local dental clinic. They do not go to the country club anymore because their membership was revoked for non-payment. They do not host lavish dinner parties with crystal glasses and expensive wine. They are completely consumed by the exhausting, bone-deep reality of living paycheck to paycheck, a terrifying reality they had happily tried to force onto my shoulders. But the most poetic and devastating justice of all fell upon their precious golden child. Emma had spent her entire life believing she was completely untouchable, simply because she was pretty loud and fiercely protected by my parents. When Trent stormed out of the law firm boardroom that day, he did not just leave the legal meeting. He left her completely. Once the cowardly opportunist realized the fraudulent commercial loan was dead and that my parents were facing severe federal legal threats and total financial ruin, he filed for divorce with absolute ruthless speed. He abandoned Emma, leaving her completely alone and drowning in a massive mountain of credit card debt they had accumulated during their fake luxury lifestyle. Because Susan and Robert had blindly co-signed several of Trent's initial highly leveraged business loans, firmly believing he was a genius tech entrepreneur, they are now legally chained to his massive financial failures. They are spending their golden retirement years working exhausting entry-level physical jobs, not to build a comfortable future, but to slowly, painfully pay off the catastrophic debts of the man who married and immediately abandoned their favorite daughter. Emma, having absolutely zero marketable skills and zero savings, had to move into that tiny, depressing rental apartment with them. The three of them are trapped together in a miserable, cramped space, constantly arguing, constantly resenting their circumstances, and constantly blaming each other for their ruined lives. Susan finally got her deepest wish. Emma is her only child now. They have nobody else to manipulate, nobody else to exploit, and nobody else to blame for their own terrible choices. I sincerely wish them all the luck in the world, because they are going to need every single ounce of it just to survive the mess they created. I used to feel a deep, heavy, suffocating guilt whenever I imagined cutting my biological family out of my life. Society constantly conditions us to believe that blood is an unbreakable sacred bond. We are repeatedly told that we must forgive our parents no matter how horribly they treat us, simply because they gave us life. But I learned the hardest, most painful way possible, that toxic bloodlines will slowly poison your entire soul if you do not find the courage to sever them. Cutting them off was not an act of petty revenge. It was an act of pure, absolute survival. It was without a doubt the healthiest and most necessary decision I have ever made in my 28 years on this earth. Today, my daily life is completely unrecognizable from the miserable, anxious existence I led just a year ago. The massive financial profit from the estate sale has given me absolute economic freedom and security. I invested the money quietly and smartly, ensuring I will never have to worry about my basic needs or my future stability. At work, my career has absolutely skyrocketed. Without the exhausting daily burden of managing my parents' chaotic, failing logistics company and balancing their fraudulent books, my focus at the corporate auditing firm sharpened incredibly. My performance improved so drastically that I was recently promoted to a senior director position overseeing major national corporate accounts. I walk into massive corporate boardrooms now, and I do not make myself small. I do not hide in the corner or apologize for my presence. I speak with clear authority, and I am deeply respected by my peers and my clients. I no longer accept less than I deserve in any single area of my life. More importantly, I have finally discovered what real, authentic family actually looks like. Real family does not demand that you set yourself on fire just to keep them warm. Real family does not forge your signature on federal banking documents or publicly humiliate you in front of strangers to protect their own fragile, pathetic egos. I spend my weekends with true loyal friends who support my ambitions and uplift my spirit. Mr. Harrison has moved beyond being just my attorney and has become a genuine trusted mentor and a true father figure to me. We have a standing lunch appointment every other week, and he treats me with the professional respect and personal kindness I spent 3 decades desperately begging my biological father to show me. I am surrounded by a beautiful, chosen family of people who truly value my presence, who loudly celebrate my successes, and who would never, ever dream of treating me like a disposable utility. I am completely, entirely, and profoundly free. I finally respect and love the strong, capable woman I see in the mirror every morning, and nobody will ever be allowed to take that away from me again. If you have made it this far into my story, I want to ask you a very important and personal question. Have you ever found yourself in a position where you had to walk away from people who share your blood but do not share your morals or your values? Have you ever had to summon the courage to draw a hard, immovable boundary and choose your own mental peace over keeping a toxic family comfortable? Please drop a comment below and share your own experience. I read every single one of your comments, and I want to read your story. While you are down there in the comments section, please let me know where in the world you are watching this video from today and what time it is there right now. I am constantly amazed by how far these personal stories travel across the globe and how many of us share the exact same hidden emotional struggles. If my personal journey resonated with you, if you felt that same righteous anger when they tried to steal my future, and that same beautiful, overwhelming relief when the truth finally came out and justice was served, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It costs you absolutely nothing to click those buttons, but it helps these videos reach other people who might be sitting in the dark right now, wondering if they are the problem in their own families. I want them to hear this story so they know that they are not alone and that it is perfectly acceptable to finally choose themselves. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to my story and for being such a wonderful, supportive part of this incredible online community. Until next time, please remember that your worth is never defined by the people who are too blind or too selfish to see it. Take care of yourself because you absolutely deserve a beautiful, peaceful life. I look back at the person I used to be and I barely recognize her. For nearly 3 decades, I lived in a constant state of emotional exhaustion. I was the reliable daughter, the quiet workhorse, the practical accountant who was expected to clean up every single mess my family created. I believed with all my heart that if I just worked a little harder, if I just paid one more bill, if I just smiled and stayed in the background, my parents would eventually realize my worth. I thought my absolute loyalty would eventually earn their love. That is the greatest lie we are taught to believe about family. Society constantly feeds us this narrative that blood is thicker than water and that you must always forgive the people who raised you. We are told that family is a sacred bond that can never be broken, no matter how much pain it causes you. But nobody ever talks about what happens when the people who share your blood are the exact same people holding your head underwater. When you grow up in a house where love is treated as a currency, you learn to become a very good bargainer. My parents created an environment where affection was something you had to buy. For my sister Emma, that meant playing the role of the beautiful, helpless golden child. She was paraded around country clubs and treated like a prized possession because her superficial charm reflected well on my parents' massive egos. For me, the currency was utility. I was only valuable when I was useful. I was the safety net they abused, the bank account they drained, and the scapegoat they blamed whenever their carefully constructed illusions began to crack. I spent my entire youth trying to buy a seat at a table where I was never truly welcome. I thought I was being a good daughter by stepping in and saving them from their own reckless financial choices. I thought my sacrifices were acts of love, but true love does not ask you to sacrifice your future to fund someone else's delusion. True love does not forge your signature on federal banking documents. True love does not look you in the eyes in a crowded dining room and tell you that you are a burden. It took me 28 years to finally understand that my parents did not love me. They loved what I could do for them. They loved my credit score. They loved my paycheck. They loved my silence. The moment I stopped being a silent, compliant utility, the moment I discovered their criminal fraud and decided to protect myself, their true colors were revealed for the entire world to see. They were willing to send me to federal prison just to maintain the illusion of their wealthy suburban lifestyle. They were perfectly happy to destroy my life if it meant saving their own. Walking away from them was the hardest thing I have ever done, but it was also the most profoundly liberating moment of my entire existence. People who have never experienced this specific kind of family trauma will never truly understand the courage it takes to leave. Well-meaning friends and distant relatives will inevitably tell you that you are being too harsh. They will tell you that life is short and that you only get one mother and one father. They will try to use guilt as a weapon to drag you back into the chaos because your boundaries make them uncomfortable. But you must never let the opinions of outsiders dictate the boundaries of your own mental health. People who judge your boundaries have never had to survive your pain. I want to be absolutely clear about something. Setting boundaries is not an act of revenge. It is not an act of betrayal. Setting a boundary is an act of pure absolute survival. When I slid that sealed envelope across the mahogany table in Mr. Harrison's law firm, I was not trying to destroy my parents. They had already destroyed themselves through their own greed and their own arrogance. I was simply refusing to go down with their sinking ship. A boundary is nothing more than a door with a heavy lock. It allows you to decide who gets access to your energy, your resources, and your peace. For my entire life, my parents had full, unrestricted access to my house and my heart, and they completely trashed both. Changing the locks was the only way I could finally begin to clean up the mess. The fallout of my decision was exactly what you would expect from people who refuse to take accountability for their own actions. My parents are currently living in a cramped rental apartment, working exhausting jobs just to survive. My sister Emma, whose entire personality was built on being a pampered princess, is now completely alone, trying to figure out how to function in the real world after her husband abandoned her. Sometimes I think about them sitting in that small apartment, blaming me for everything that went wrong in their lives. They will never accept that their current misery is the direct mathematical result of their own terrible choices. They will always cast themselves as the victims of an ungrateful daughter. And the most beautiful part of my new life is that I simply do not care anymore. Their narrative is no longer my reality. I do not have to carry their heavy, toxic baggage for another single second. When you finally cut ties with toxic family members, the first thing you feel is a massive, overwhelming wave of guilt. It is completely natural. You have been conditioned since childhood to prioritize their comfort over your own survival. But if you can just push through that initial guilt, you will find something absolutely incredible on the other side. You will find peace, the kind of deep, quiet, unshakable peace that settles into your bones and makes the air feel lighter. I wake up in the morning now, and my house is perfectly quiet. There are no frantic phone calls demanding money. There are no passive-aggressive text messages comparing me to my sister. There are no manufactured crises designed to drain my bank account. There is only peace. I have built a life that I am incredibly proud of. My career as a senior corporate auditor has blossomed because I finally have the emotional energy to invest in my own potential. I have surrounded myself with a chosen family of brilliant, supportive friends who celebrate my successes instead of resenting them. Mr. Harrison, the veteran attorney who helped me navigate the darkest week of my life, has become a true mentor to me. I have learned that genuine family is not determined by a birth certificate. Genuine family is defined by mutual respect, by honesty, and by the people who stand beside you when the storm hits, instead of being the ones who push you into the rain. I share my story because I know how isolating it feels to be the scapegoat. I know exactly what it feels like to sit in a room full of your own relatives and feel completely, entirely alone. I know the desperate, exhausting ache of trying to earn love from people whose hearts are completely bankrupt. If you are watching this and you are currently trapped in that cycle, I need you to listen to me very carefully. You are not crazy. You are not asking for too much. You are not broken just because the people who were supposed to protect you decided to break you instead. Your worth is not determined by your ability to tolerate abuse. Your worth is not measured by how much money you can lend to irresponsible relatives. You have an absolute fundamental right to protect your peace, your finances, and your future. It takes an incredible amount of strength to look at your own family and say, enough. It takes profound bravery to pack up your life and walk away from the only dynamic you have ever known, even when that dynamic is destroying you. But I promise you with every single fiber of my being that the quiet, peaceful life waiting for you on the other side of that boundary is worth every tear and every moment of doubt. You do not have to set yourself on fire just to keep toxic people warm. You are allowed to walk away. You are allowed to build a beautiful, successful life that they have absolutely zero access to. You are allowed to finally be the main character in your own story instead of a disposable background character in theirs. I want to build a community where we can share these hard truths and support each other through the process of healing. I know there are thousands of people out there carrying the exact same heavy burdens I used to carry. We have all faced the manipulation, the gaslighting, and the crushing societal pressure to just keep the peace. But true peace only comes when you demand respect. If you have ever had to draw a hard boundary with toxic family members, I want to hear your story. Please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment below telling me where you are watching from and what time it is there. I read every single one. Take care of yourself because you deserve to be chosen first.